Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Cody.
I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And today we're going to be discussing chapter 19, comprising pages 219 to 232 of Against the Day. I also hope that nobody that listens to the show greatly dislikes hearing my voice because there's going to be a significant amount of historical information sharing on this episode, sort of a la the workers' rights and sort of union formation detail from several chapters ago. So I'm gonna do my best to not bore the audience as I try to elucidate the reasons World War I happened, which is largely my reaction to this chapter as a whole. It's just that World War I is so stupid. Like, I already knew that it was stupid, just from a perspective of effectively after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, the war escalated as a result of like, don't pick on him, he's my friend, but on country scales.
Yeah.
But now that I have a much greater grasp of the sort of foundational elements that led to it, it's dumb. It might be the dumbest war that has ever been fought. And really, as I'll do my best to kind of elucidate over the course of this episode, I think underpins a lot of the themes of Against the Day to this point, about sort of the death of the old age, the death of sort of magic and wonder, and kind of a fusion of science and other things, and the start of sort of the capitalistic age and the moneyed interest age, and sort of the creation of the capital T they. That's my kind of overarching response to this chapter. What did you guys think of it?
Well, I'll preface by saying that if I feel that our already glacial pacing of the episodes slows down anymore during your historical context sections, I'll just throw some exciting music behind it or something, or some boings and zoings.
Nice. Yeah.
That being said, I greatly enjoyed the chapter. It was a nice departure from the previous chapter and its bleakness and just overall dreariness. And it is, I remember when we talked about this last time, about splitting this into two episodes between 18 and 19, and rereading it again this morning, I thought, yeah, there is so much going on in this little chapter. It's like 11 pages, and it's insane how much is crammed into here. And it really feels like this is sort of the first real I know there's a name for it when, like, on a roller coaster, that kind of section of going just before you tip over, you've kind of reached this apex of anticipation and suspense building, and it's just about to tip over. And this chapter feels like there's that push off almost, where there's just so much being dumped at you and it's just flying in your face. All you can really do is just hold on, enjoy reading it. There's some brilliant writing and there's some really cool stuff going on. I had to stop so often to look stuff up, and I finally got to a point where I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna kind of go with this for a little bit and just enjoy the journey. I'll pick up what I can along the way.
Oh yeah, I've read this chapter I think 5 times over the course of the past 3 weeks.
Yeah, as for my opinion on this chapter, I'm gonna. I don't really like this chapter very much. It's probably my least favorite chapter so far. I want to preface what I'm gonna say with the fact that I am looking forward to Kate and the rest of the co-hosts' contributions, and looking forward to all the historical context they're going to provide. That being said, I feel like, whenever Pynchon does like seances and stuff in Gravity's Rainbow, I just feel like the Gravity's Rainbow seances are better done. I feel like they're kind of, the Gravity's Rainbow seances are a little bit more on the nose in terms of directly addressing the themes of the book, almost to a fault. Like, where it seems to be the seances in Gravity's Rainbow basically state the themes of Gravity's Rainbow to you. And I just found this chapter hard to parse. I don't like don't like the fact that it seems like he did a bunch of research and just kind of information dumps on the reader. And I also, I mean, like the part in at near the end where like we get like 2 or 3 long paragraphs about like an alternate history of England in the 1800s. It's interesting, but it's also like I have no idea what's going on. With that, I don't know who any of these people are. I don't know why it matters, why I'm getting this information. I do understand that the information preceding that is about the lead up to World War One, and that is interesting to me in some ways. That being said, the lead up to World War One and World War One itself are both kind of very hard to understand, just for basically anyone. I think. I find, and because it's so confusing, I find it less intriguing than say like the lead up to World War Two. All of that being said, I am looking forward to especially Kate's contributions. I'm hoping that with some more context and stuff that I'll appreciate this chapter more. I do like the beginning of it. I mean, all the discussion of the different kind of like rival, like psychic groups, or I'm blanking on the word, but like occult groups in London is pretty cool and interesting. The fact that it does somewhat document or kind of document the beginning of like the modern tarot deck is interesting. Is very interesting as somebody who is interested in tarot in general and has messed with tarot cards some, just kind of more for fun than anything else. Yeah, I mean, when I say dislike this chapter, that may be a strong way to put it. I just am kind of ambivalent about it. It is kind of a transitory chapter, and I wish there's more Neville and Nigel because they are pretty funny, and I wish there's more comedic relief. I wasn't here for last week. I think I found chapter 18 funnier than the other co-hosts did. I get that the end of it is the middle, and I mean, yeah, the middle kind of, and then the end of it is very heavy. But the stuff about Jeshamon I thought was pretty funny, and I kind of missed the humor from that chapter and this chapter. Yeah, so it's just a mixed bag for me, I guess.
I get where you're coming from, and I agree with you with it being. There's so much going on; it's hard to really parse what's happening. It's very much like that scene in The Simpsons where Homer's watching Twin Peaks and his response is brilliant. I have no idea what's going on. That's kind of how I felt through this whole chapter the couple of times that I read it for this. So I agree with you there for sure.
Yeah, I would also agree, Luke. Like as much as I was able to mine information out of this chapter 4, like it did get to a certain point where I was spending, 5 days researching stuff mentioned in one paragraph, where I was like, this feels too much. It's cool that I think anyway that I understand the overarching like point of the chapter and what all of these different references point towards. But I do agree with you in that it is a lot, and it's a lot in a relatively short amount of time that. And of course, I don't know if any of this is like further explained as the book goes on, which would sort of negate the need for me to do as much research as I did. But if that is not the case, it does feel like Pynchon is really relying on his reader to do a significantly larger amount of pretty like dry reading and research to understand all of the references that he's making. Than he normally does. It does feel like this information could have been spread out over a longer period or peppered throughout, as opposed to shoving it all within one chapter, and particularly like the last 5 pages of that chapter. So I definitely do see where you're coming from, and I do not think that the additional sort of reading demands of this chapter are a reasonable request of a reader.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I really don't disagree with anything any of y'all have said. As much as I love the occult stuff and I love the way that Pynchon bases head on the the obscurancy of science in this time period and the way that world powers were being influenced by, these kinds of secret societies.
Mhm.
And the humor is excellent. Like let's be slightly conservative and say like 5 sentences per page, I think, are hilarious. And the issue is, like y'all have kind of laid out, it's not that it's necessarily too dense. It's that like it's doing too many things. Just like this is a term that no one hears come out of my mouth very much, but self-indulgent. Like it is. It is, to me, trying to like set up a lot of the seance scenes in Gravity's Rainbow, Luke. Like it really is doing some masterful technical work as a chapter to set up those kinds of things and to lay all that groundwork. And in a book that everything is so expanded and made hyper real, and to have all of these chunks of very dense subjects that are not widely understood, to have them all shoved into dialogue with a new character who is both obscure to the reader and to the other characters, and is also misrepresenting herself to some extent. Like I'm happy with ambiguity and I'm happy with density. It just feels like it's a massive jarring shift of pace that doesn't actually do anything better than splitting it up a little bit might have.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree completely. With all that being said, I do believe you have a summary of the chapter for us, Luke.
I do, yeah. All right, so chapter 19. Back to the delights of evil, Nigel announces near the beginning of this chapter, and we soon come to know exactly what he means by that. Nigel and Neville are members of the TWIT, or the true worshippers of the ineffable Tetractus, a group of miscreants and ne'er-do-wells that is somewhat adjacent to the Theosophical Society, the Society for Psychical Research, and the Order of the Golden Dawn. Soon enough, Lou is drawn into their circle and soon meets the TWIT's leader, the Grand Cohen Nookshaft, who tries to convince Lou that the explosion that propelled him into Neville and Nigel's circle was actually a portal to another dimension. Next, Lou is saved from the Grand Cohen by Neville and Nigel introducing him to Yasmin, a cunning woman with prodigious wit. Later in the night, the Grand Cohen continues to berate Lou about his views on what a detective should be and on the major arcana of the tarot, as well as original sin. Later, Lou and Yasmin go for a walk and discuss the TWIT and its members. Lou visits the physical incarnations of the major arcana, then joins the Grand Cohen as they make their way to a seance run by Natalia Eskimoff. On the way, Lou is informed of a pair of university professors named Werfner and Renfrew, who are bitter opponents. Once they arrive, the group are immediately embroiled in a discussion of alternate dimensions and the current state of the socio-political machinations of various European powers around the world.
Okay, I want everyone to keep in mind just how simple that summary was as we go through this chapter, because Luke has basically hit the nail on the head with all that happens in this chapter.
Yeah.
A guy meets a bunch of guys and then goes to a seance. That's basically it. In trying to think of how to actually sort of structure this episode and this discussion, I feel like perhaps, especially if you're someone who doesn't want to listen to however long this is going to be for me to go through the context and for us to kind of give our impressions of it, to kind of give an overall summary of what I think Pynchon is doing. And then, if you feel like you don't want to listen to the very long stretches of discussion where I'm going to talk about the Kingdom of Serbia and the Treaty of San Stefano and all that stuff, you can go ahead and kind of skip it. So if no one's in opposition to that concept, I'll kind of provide what I think this chapter is meant to do. We've talked extensively over the course of this podcast, and I would say one of the most interesting things for me in doing this podcast is how our discussions and our close readings of these books as we've gone through have sort of led to our understanding of these books as telling this alternate history of the United States and to certain extents sort of the development of capitalism in the world as a whole. And that there are certain thematic inferences that Pynchon keeps coming back to explain some of those developments. Part of that, some of these common themes, is this idea of the capital T they, the people who are kind of secretly controlling things, or the muddied interests who kind of get themselves into positions to influence powers that may be. Another thing that we've talked about a lot is how sort of in a pre-modern world, there was this sort of element of majesty or inherent sort of magic or an Edenic quality to the world, that as capitalism rises and as industrialization rises, that gets worn away until there's sort of nothing left. And then you are left with these sort of forces and counterforces working against one another. In my perspective, and you guys are free to disagree with me, a lot of what Pynchon is trying to lay out in this chapter is sort of the last stages of that before the world that he is writing in and the world that we have been living in kind of takes primacy over the old world. And he does that through a couple of different ways. One, to draw repeated attention to these different important figures of science or newspaper publishing or sort of engineering, and showcase how all of these people contributed greatly to the modern world that we live in, but they also had these like strange beliefs in either, say like seances that actually do connect you with the underworld and people who have died, or remote viewing, or automatic writing, or however many different things that these people kind of all had an association with ceremonial magic, and that kind of represents a fusion of this old world and things that are coming out of the new world with advancements in technology and commerce. And then he also looks at the underpinnings of World War I as a way to analyze how World War I is probably not a completely unique case, but certainly one of the most easily identifiable cases of a war being fought over nothing but sort of private interest and political jockeying with no particular end beyond control of commerce or trade. These things, of course, have underpinnings to multiple wars over the course of thousands of years prior to World War I, but World War I in particular really feels like a war that was fought for no purpose other than these particular sort of private interests or commercial interests, or sort of the disagreements over kind of the last gasps of the industrialized sort of or aristocracy that was waning at that time in history. And that it was largely kind of brought about by maybe private interests or outside sort of agitators or people well placed within positions of power to influence their governments to do things. And that in a way leads to the kind of last gasp of this old world dying and the new world coming to replace it. That is my best sort of guess at understanding what Pynchon is trying to say in this chapter from a broad thematic perspective. And of course, as we continue to go on, I will sort of try and break down that over the course of the references that he makes. How do we feel? Do we have any thoughts on that?
I think you're spot on, especially for where we're at in the story. I think really the only thing I don't necessarily think I would add this, because I think you kind of already touched on it a little bit, but this is also, I think, his most globally spanning novel. We haven't really gotten to that point entirely yet, but it will start to kind of lay itself out a little bit more as the novel unfolds. But I think that ties in with the fact that you have this is kind of that turning point in history as well as everything else going on. All these sort of grasps of power and these very, very rich people starting to realize the ability that they have and the power that they can wield over people. This is also when the world itself starts to connect itself. Prior to this time period, the ability to travel overseas, to travel to different countries, was really, really heavily restricted because you did not have mass forms of transportation. But this is where we have the railroads are starting to come together. You're starting to have international transport across the oceans. So the world is starting to see more of itself, and that will, in different ways, that's where all these kind of powers start to struggle with each other, like you were talking about, and try to jockey for who can have the most grip over everything. And so there's a reason it was a world war, and there was a reason it happened when it happened, and that's largely a part of it, is just that now we are able to connect with these people across the globe that we had previously never had the ability to really do that with.
Yeah.
And on top of everything both of y'all laid out, I would just add the a particular focus on the nature of syncretism and of like scientism as forces in our modern world, the kind of outlining the way that occult esoteric syncretism of grabbing up these various things and mushing them together without any care for coherence, just because it feels right. How that mirrors the way that early science was being put into use by these kinds of organizations that helped to lead to World War I.
Yeah, I would love for you to add more detail on that as we go, if you have particular cases that you can point out, because you're absolutely right. Okay, so sort of moving into the content of the chapter itself. As Luke pointed out at the beginning of the chapter, Lou is suddenly in England with his friends that he met sort of after his dynamite blast, and his friends introduce him to this organization called the DWIT, or the True Worshippers of the Ineffable Tetractus. This was one of the things that I had a hard time finding any good detail on. From what I understand, the Tetractus is a sort of element of Pythagoreanism that has been considered to be adopted by a lot of other things. People will point out the similarities between the Tetractus. I'm going to mess up so many words.
Oh my God, you have no idea how hard it is for me to say that stupid word.
The Tetractus, and then like the Kabbalistic image of the Tree of Life, and a whole lot of other sort of elements of esoterica. But that essentially this particular design, in one way or another, kind of allows you to plot out the elements of like the human soul on a map, or mapped to the design itself. Does anyone have better detail for that?
I cannot provide any better detail on like the slightly more occult, like direct meanings of the Tetractus. I can provide some context though for like why it's viewed in those ways that you outlined. So one of the things that's really interesting about this chapter, and that I actually think is both really important to outline for understanding this chapter, and is the first bit of that syncretism talk, is that the Tetractus historically does not have numerals. It's not numbered. It's just a symbol of these 10 points arranged in a pyramid. And the way that it's used is much more like like Kate said, there's not all that much that isn't essentially completely arbitrary that you can find talking about the meaning of those of the symbolism of the Tetractus. But like Wikipedia has basically all of the hard or not archaeology but anthropology, kind of pinned down, and it's like this the one and the nature of the one leading to two, and the combination of the nature of one and the two leading to the existence of thirds, and these things compounding in ways that are very much in the realm of esotericism these days, but like, well, and back then they were like, in classical Greece. But the reason that they're like significant in the modern era is essentially because of Plato. And the way people think about Plato these days is as the guy who wrote about Socrates. But the way that people thought about Plato back in his days was as a weird esoteric cult leader, essentially, who took Pythagorean ideas like the tetractys and expanded them from a purely notional idea of like numbers being the basis of reality in a way that's not. When I say numbers being the basis of reality, it makes it much more hollow than it was meant. But the Platonic interpretation of these kinds of things is one where the tetractys is this baseline way for the person who is uninformed and is going through their normal life to meditate on ideas that allow access to what Plato believed were these ideal forms in essentially like the higher plane of existence. And so when like Neville and Nigel are described as explaining it as to look at the array as occupying not 2 but 3 dimensions and then to expand from there, it's more that the dots themselves represent the expansion of dimensions beyond the concept of the one. Does that help anything?
That certainly added detail that I was not sort of able to parse out or find.
Mhm.
That begins this paragraph on the first page of this chapter. In the same paragraph that we get sort of a description of the mansion that they're meeting in, we get our first historical figure that's mentioned. There's so many of them that, unlike what we've done in previous episodes where I've given kind of like a larger history, I just kind of have to give you guys the cliff notes on most of them. The mansion was designed by a guy named Sir John Sloane. He was a Freemason. So of course, we have another one of these secret orders getting brought up right away, and was a very important architect for the British Empire, particularly in London, and for sort of royal sites. If you look through his Wikipedia, there is a exhaustive list of like important structures that he either designed or built or renovated. So we have our first case of a historical individual who kind of bridges this gap between modernity and these secret societies. He was a member of the Freemasons, but at the same time, he was also very important to sort of the look or the design of a lot of royal state houses, and I think he even designed like a prison. So he did a lot of work for the British government as a whole in architecture. We also get a reference to Madame Blavatsky as the person who the actual building itself dates back to around the time that this woman died. Madame Blavatsky is a very important figure to the development of occultism and esoterica and all of this stuff. She was a Russian-born leader of the Theosophican Society. That society believed in, as Will has kind of already mentioned, a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, and had a catchphrase where their kind of byword was, "There is no higher religion than truth." In 1905, they then created a charter with the following objectives. First was to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, caste, or color. Second was to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. And third was to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. Blavatsky was one of the first people in America, in particular, to formally convert to Buddhism. She then sort of returned to Europe after a while, where she eventually died of influenza. In the wake of her death, that society that she was responsible for helping found underwent like a whole bunch of schisms of people disagreeing over the nature of these sort of tenets that they went, and founded the society on, what they should be used for, and as a result, it sort of fractured the society, and they went on to found a bunch of different organizations that members of are scattered across this whole chapter in reference to. Two of those organizations are also in the same paragraph. The first is the Society for Physical Research, which was sort of the first of these groups to come up for the purpose of research and publication of papers, as opposed to sort of a internal study, or like a choice to study these things for the purpose of your own kind of edification. And then the second is the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a crazy organization that has all sorts of different rights and ranks to it, and has a whole bunch of different blendings of different types of mysticism, or like esoteric religion or occultism, but is largely considered important because it gave us Aleister Crowley, for one, who everybody knows and has been referenced in a lot of material, both in Pinch On and Out. And then also it kind of set up the foundations for how a lot of modern occultism operates, in specifically within the world of like Wicca, or esoteric, or not esoteric, what's the word I'm thinking of? Eclectic paganism. A lot of what people who practice those things get their sort of foundational texts from, or knowledge, or sort of lineage from, comes from that Order of the Golden Dawn. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that first paragraph?
I've got a little bit of extra historical context.
Go for it.
With regard to Blavatsky.
Mhm.
What's really notable about Blavatsky as a figure is that, like, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of people operating in similar spheres as her, and of course she kickstarted a lot of what came later, and really was the person who began this boom of secret esoteric societies. And her writings established a lot of what is now assumed knowledge in the New Age world.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that as many of those dozens, if not hundreds, of people contemporaneous to her were 100% sincere, she is one of the few who is definitely fraudulent. She definitely did not believe everything that she said.
Mm-hmm.
And she established the narrative of, like, it wasn't her idea, but she was the one who established the legitimacy of the idea of the Aryan master race in popular culture. Before her, before the theosophy, it was just something that, like, random novelists were playing with, and she borrowed a lot of those ideas and recontextualized them as a secret real history.
Some additional details that I have on both of these societies. The Society for Physical Research, as I mentioned, was primarily a research society. The things that they investigated and published on were phenomena and abilities like hypnotism, dissociation, thought transference, and mediumship, as well as the Reichenbach phenomena, apparitions, haunted houses, and seances. I love the blend of almost high and low, like occultism and culture, just in the list of the stuff that they researched. That feels very Pinchonian. The interesting thing too with this particular group is they actually still exist. They, as far as I can tell, do a lot more work from like skepticism now, from a perspective of investigating sort of occurrences or phenomena with the purpose of explaining how they may or may not be sort of otherwise justified or explained. The current president is a psychology professor at a university in Gothenburg, Sweden. And they have published in numerous journals over the course of their history. They are actually responsible for coining the term telepathy. We get that from that particular society. As I mentioned, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was formed out of a schism within the Theosophical Society after one particular guy named William Wynne Westcott left the actual that initial society. They were a magical order who practiced occult hermeticism and metaphysics through theology and spiritual development, is what they would say. Their influence, as I mentioned, was so great that a great, percentage of modern magical practices can find their roots there. Their practices fused Kabbalistic ideas and sort of theory and ritual with astrology, tarot, geomancy, scrying, alchemy, and astral projection. As the temple itself grew, they found themselves needing to create different ranks and different levels of order. And we actually have, like I said, Aleister Crowley becomes a member, and he begins to rise through the ranks very, very fast, up to a particular level called Adeptus Minor. When he was promoted to that, this kind of caused a minor schism within the order itself, and led in, which eventually turned into like a full-on revolt against his membership to that order. And so what he decided to do was to leave and found his own order. And him leaving the Golden Dawn is considered by some historians of this particular type of history to have considered to be the end of the first great age of occultism. And of course, from there, it sort of splinters out into so many different numerous elements and outlets that it's basically impossible to follow. Aleister Crowley's elevation to that level within the Golden Dawn kind of was like the Great Schism in the Christian Church, where there was enough disagreement that suddenly all of these people who were previously unified found themselves feeling emboldened to go and do their own things. From that point, we get a actual drawn image of what the sort of Tetractys looks like with the numbers, as Will explained. And then from here, we get to the idea that essentially these characters that Lou has found himself kind of in the company of are trying to initiate him into TWIT. Their intention is for him to join them. And we are introduced to Nicholas Nookshaft Grand Cohen of the London chapter of TWIT, a person in mystical robes appliqued with astrological and alchemical symbols and a bowl haircut with short fringes. Neville and Nigel, allowing for some chemical exaggeration, tell us they saw you emerge out of an explosion. The question that arises is, where were you just before? Another detail of kind of explaining how these things fit different elements of religion or belief systems together. The term Cohen is the Hebrew word for priest. The Levitical order would have referred to themselves as Cohens when the sort of temple age of the kingdom of Israel existed. So this is another just sort of reference to where they're pulling this information from. And then from what follows there is, as Luke mentioned, a conversation between the Grand Cohen of the London chapter and Lou over whether or not blowing up in that explosion has actually transferred him from one world to another or one reality to another, which I think goes without saying that gets into a lot of what we've been talking about over the course of this book so far, from an idea of doubling or passages between realities that's been sort of littered all over the first 200 pages of this book. Wanted to ask you guys what you thought of this conversation and the implications of it. What are your thoughts or theories on what has happened to Lou?
It's an interesting direction for his character, and I have to keep myself where we are in the book and not get ahead of things. But I think it's doing a really good job of setting up this concept of the sort of parallelism of time or of history, or however you want to look at it, and the sort of divergent realities that kind of stem from it. This is an idea that, this isn't new at this point in literature. This is the kind of thing that's been played around with in a lot of different forms of media, and it's just a really interesting way of putting a spin on it and tying it into all this world history. I really like this. I think part of what I like about this whole chapter, despite its insane density, is I always have a fascination with this sort of like magic realism kind of thing. I don't buy into it in a reality kind of sense. I just like to. I think it's a fun kind of world to play in, a world in which this sort of mysticism and bizarre physics bending kind of thing is a fun world to sort of read about. And so this idea of Lou learning that like maybe the explosion pushed him into some sort of other dimension or other reality or other timeline or whatever the case may be, it's a really interesting setup for his character, and especially him as a detective. I think that works really well with that type of character. So it also just kind of, I think, is funny. I try to imagine Lou like dealing with this guy with his bowl cut and his he looks like, he's dressed like the Cookie Crisp wizard from way back in the day. So it's just, I don't know. I find it a very funny scene to imagine. But at the same time, I just enjoy the idea of it, trying to kind of make it a realistic thing.
Thank you for naming the Cookie Crisp wizard. I couldn't place what it was referencing, but yeah.
You're very welcome.
I think it's an interesting passage in the sense that, like, I love these characters of Pynchon's, these goofball sages who about half the time say nonsense and about half the time say something that's meaningful. I can't say I particularly like Nookshaft here. He's a little bit of
a charlatan.
Well, yeah. To say the least, but
yeah.
But also, like, it's just it does a really good job of setting up the ways that, like, the more spiritual side of, like, say, the Christian anarchists thought of themselves, and also like syncretism stuff does a really good job of demonstrating this idea of like, oh, the chemical explosion interrupts the usual flow of the day, and it's like, okay, you are utilizing like 3 different schemata of metaphysics here and just shoving them all together and assuming that they'll all work out because you can think of them all in terms of his logic for how transferring between these parallel universes would work. It's pretty delightfully nonsensical and only hangs together because of like essentially linguistic coincidence, and that's always fun.
Definitely.
Yeah, I like this conversation a good amount. It is fun to think about. I'm not sure how it would work with, like, we haven't seen Lou really interact with his storyline hasn't intersected with any other storylines in this book as of yet, and I kind of forget if it ever does. So I suppose it is possible that he had been living in an alternate dimension and the explosion kind of either died or some of the explosion opened up a portal to another dimension. I suppose that's certainly possible. I get it's a fictional book, but I wouldn't call it probable. It's fun to think about though. And it would explain some of the stuff earlier in the book, which I think we've been over already in previous episodes, but it would explain him not remembering what horrible thing he did that everyone else seems convinced that he did and stuff like that. Like perhaps he has some type of he for whatever reason he perhaps continuously switches to new universes or something like that throughout the book, which again is just kind of fun to think about, but I'm not sure if I really believe it or in real life believe that that's at all possible, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah, and you are right, it would make sense for his character. the specifically with what you're referencing, this idea that he just woke up one day and suddenly had committed some sort of horrific crime that he has no memory of. The kind of relevant quote to that is where it says, the Cohen elaborated lateral world sets. Other parts of creation lie all around us, each with its crossover points or gates of transfer from one to another. And they can be anywhere, really. An unscheduled explosion introduced into the accustomed flow of the day may easily open now and then passages to elsewhere, like what Will was referencing just a few minutes ago. I think another kind of important quote from this conversation is, Tisk, they are shamans, Mr. Bastnight, the closest we in our fallen state may ever come to the uncivilized purity of the world as it was and shall never be again, not for the likes of us. So aiming towards this idea that Pynchon is building in the chapter of the world as it was, the world in its sort of more pure state is over and done with. We can't do anything about it. We can't go back to it. It's this sort of new bastardized version is kind of here to stay, which I think is going to increase in relevance over the course of the chapter. We do also get another character introduced. Does someone want to read her introduction right there at the end of 221, starting with allow us?
Yeah, I can. Allow us and Nigel to introduce Miss, or actually, as she's the 17th degree adept, one ought properly to say Zadik, except that obviously, well, blimey, it's really only old Yashmin, isn't it? Added Neville. Well put, Neville, and why don't you go reward yourself with a pie or something? Perhaps, Nigel, you'd like one up your nose as well. Silence, dribbling one, snarled the girl. Imagine how idiotic they'd be if they could talk.
I wish there was more of her in this chapter, because she's really, I think, is a fun character who lightens the mood in the early portions. I would have loved more of her once the chapter gets real heavy, especially with her sort of pointing out stupid aspects of this society or not really believing in it. Of course, we get another crossover with Hebrew spiritualism with the use of the term Zadok. Zadok is a Hebrew word that within Talmudic philosophy refers to this idea that there are 36 or less righteous Jews in the world at any given time, which keeps Hashem from destroying the world. So in the same way that in the Hebrew Old Testament, Abraham tries to kind of bargain with God over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by saying, if there's this many righteous people, well, what if there's this many righteous people? Well, what if there's this many righteous people, as a way to try and get him to not destroy the two cities. In Talmudic philosophy, there's this idea that these 32 or less righteous Jews that exist at any time sort of keep Hashem from destroying the world as a whole now. The interesting thing with this, though, is that TWIT organizes, as we'll get to, kind of their philosophy or their belief system, or however you want to call it, around the tarot. And they refer to her as a 17th degree adept. Now, the Pynchon wiki for this book is real strange. And there's a lot of, I'll say, in my opinion, pointless hand-wringing over what the number 17 means in the context of this character. I think it's pretty plain because of the fact that TWIT uses the tarot as their guiding principle, where if you look up what the actual number 17 is within the tarot system, it brings you to the star card. And the star often translates its meaning in tarot readings to fertility, and has a depiction of kind of a woman nourishing the earth to continue the cycle of fertility. So there's a merging here, in my opinion, that is happening of the meaning of the star tarot and the meaning of this word Zadok, which is basically implying that through her existence as a Zadok and whoever the others who maybe have that title are, they are continuing to nourish the earth in this cycle of fertility that keeps within that Talmudic framework, that keeps Hashem from destroying the earth. that's the best that I was able to come up with for this particular sort of esoteric references. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add.
I do think that there's a gem in the Pynchon Wiki pointing out the MIT study, where whoever contributed this wrote, described at MIT as the most random number according to Hacker's lore. This is supposedly because in a study where respondents were asked to choose a random number from 1 to 20, 17 was the most common choice. And I 17 is a prime number, and I do think that some of that like meaningless connection drawing in the Pynchon Wiki is meaningless, but I think it is in the spirit of this chapter in particular to like highlight all of those absolutely nonsensical ideas. Like, I mean, we just got done talking about the idea of like there being parallel universes that overlap and intersect with random conjunction points, and I think Pynchon likes to choose those kinds of, in the programming world, a magic number for the sake of just being a magic number.
Yeah, that's fair. So from that character introduction, we get some detail about how she ended up with the order underneath a kind of protective custody, I guess is maybe the best way to describe why she's there. And I don't have too much detail on sort of that element of her character, other than that, again, this is kind of a illustration of the merging between power centers with this kind of magical element, because she's sort of been chosen by members of the military, like military commanders, to keep her safe. Anyone else have any additional details on her character that they want to share, or thoughts on it?
I mean, I love Yasmin. She is a fascinating character with some of the most interesting, like character level, interesting choices going forward. But not so much in this chapter. Aside from, to add on, that like the her personal background is kind of a weird oblique look at this weird trend in the late 1800s of British, particularly British petty nobility, like just adopting random people. It was it's just a weird trend that happened, and it's it's not really expanded upon. Yeah, like it's laid out in a way that makes sense. You understand how Oberon Halfcourt, took custody of her, and nothing untoward, and that's how most of them were. But it's just like this weird trend that definitely plays into those mixed incentives that led up to World War I.
Yeah. From there, we get more sort of detail of the Grand Cohen testing Lou, or sort of educating, maybe is a better word for it, to kind of introduce him to the order and bring him in. And we get a reference here on 222 in the quote: "To know, to dare, to will, to keep silent. How difficult for most of us to observe these basic imperatives. Particularly, you must have noticed the one about keeping silent. Have I been talking too much, by the way? Frightfully awkward situation to be in, you appreciate." He's certainly not being discreet in any significant way, with just sort of telling all of this information to a complete outsider. But the specific phrase that he uses there, to know, to dare, to will, and to keep silent, is again a sort of quotation of historical precedent. This is essentially an old occult law or guideline for both practice and spiritual development in a lot of these old societies. Essentially, the idea is that to know is the purpose behind why these people would do that. They want to acquire knowledge and understanding about things that they don't know and that they don't understand. To dare is to step outside of their comfort zone in their spiritual journey, wherever that may be taking them as they advance through the ranks of these societies, or as they continue to research certain things. To will is meant to kind of illustrate the importance of directing your energy to a specific goal. So as you develop in your spiritual journey and in your research, you end up coming towards a goal, so to speak, that you're working towards. And then finally, to keep silent, discretion, secrecy, don't allow outsiders in who may have ulterior motives or who seek to discredit. It's supposed to be both a set of guidelines, but then also kind of rules for keeping the organization safe, so to speak. Which again, I don't see how the Grand Cohen is practicing that, and he funnily sort of makes a joke about that aspect of this whole initiation process that he's putting Lou through. And then from there, we get the kind of elucidation of what TWIT is from a perspective of its belief kind of in the tarot. Does someone want to read the quote that starts on 222 but ends on 223, starting with, "Admittedly, ours is an odd sort of work"?
Yeah, I got it right. Admittedly, ours is an odd sort of work. There is but one case which preoccupies us. Its suspects are exactly 22 in number. These are precisely the cadre of operatives who, working in secret, or at least allow, history upon this island to happen, and they correspond to the 22 major arcana of the tarot deck. Going on to explain as he had times past counting that the 22 cards of the major arcana might be regarded as living agencies, positions to be filled with real people down the generations, each attending his own personally tailored portfolio of mischief, deep or trivial. As the grim determinants appeared, assassinations, plagues, failures, or fashion sense, losses of love as, one by one, flesh-eating sheep sailed over the fence between the dreams and the day. There must always be a tower. There must always be a high priestess, temperance, fortune, so forth. Now and then, when vacancies occur owing to death or other misadventure, new occupants will emerge, obliging us to locate and track them and learn their histories as well. That they inhabit without exception a silence as daunting as their near invisibility only intensifies our challenge.
And so, sort of as I understand it, Pynchon is outlaying that TWIT is an organization that uses the tarot as a way to identify important, I'll say, movers and shakers on the global stage to track the development of the day they live in and who is in what, which of course comes in much closer view as we get into the two professors later in the chapter. But the tarot deck itself, some people kind of liken to telling the journey of a soul or telling the journey of kind of a human person. So the idea that you could take that and blow that up to a global stage by saying these 22 major cards or major arcana, as I believe they call the dicosadiad later in the chapter, are really where we can pinpoint what is moving the human soul and the world forward towards whatever its destination may be. But I do think it's important to note, of course, that this is coming from a man who has already admitted that the day that they live in is despoiled. The paradise is gone. And so the idea that they would be able to do anything to fight against it already kind of feels what's the word I'm looking for, like pointless maybe. But it's just they're now just trying to kind of identify who's causing these things to happen. It's an interesting basis for a society like this to govern itself.
Yeah, tarot is one of those things that again, going back to the sort of magic realism that imbues so much of this in Pynchon's other work. It's one of those things where I wish there's always a part of me that wishes it was real, but I can't subscribe to that sort of fatalism. So it's just like it's fascinating to me, the concept behind it, but what's even more fascinating is the people who really deeply adhere to it, because there is never, and it's the same with astrology or palm reading or any of that sort of mysticism and esotericism. There is never a cohesion to it. There's always these variations that keep it from being able to be taken seriously. And so I think that's part of where it comes, this sort of like Yashmin knowing that this whole thing is ridiculous comes into play. Like I think she clearly sees through the bullshit, but I think they all do. And this ties back to what Will was talking about earlier, where Madame Blavatsky, knew that what she was doing was bullshit. And I think most, if not all, of the people who really push this stuff from Crowley to the modern day adherence to it, I don't think anyone at the top really truly believes in what they're doing. I think they just like the power and control and attention that it brings to them.
Yeah, that idea of how many true believers are there actually, and are
Right.
the people governing those societies
Exactly.
even one of them?
I would like to duck into a tiny little conspiracy alcove, if we don't mind.
Lovely.
Oh, we're in an alcove.
A
I love it.
conspiracy alcove. It's very separate from a conspiracy corner.
Yes, yes.
All the alcoves. But basically, just this is real harebrained. Please forgive me, but yes, it's a pun. It doesn't make complete nonsense that you know the Grand Cohen is describing it as being one case which preoccupies us. However, it mirrors exactly a phrase that comes up in V, which is a reference to Ludwig Wittgenstein's Decretus Logico Philosophicus, which, just for some background, for anyone who's unaware, was an attempt by a wunderkind of logical theories that basically attempted to design a consistent language to describe all possible real configurations of the world, because Wittgenstein thought that philosophy had been wasting a lot of time talking about things that couldn't be meaningfully discussed. And his essentially doctoral thesis, I mean, it wasn't a thesis, but it was essentially one, was to write out this schema of language that starts with "the world is everything that is the case." I would not bring this up except for the fact that Pynchon's first book has the line quoted, and then all of this like frantically grasping at methods of understanding the world really lines up with there is but one case which preoccupies us is the exact same meaning as "the world is everything that is the case."
Sure, yeah.
Plus the tarot.
Yeah. And I think that also, I think, does kind of underpin what he says next, and also gets into Cody's idea of just like, I'm not fatalist enough for this stuff, where he says, alas, nothing too clearly related to any statute on the books, nor likely to be. No. It is more of an ongoing transgression, accumulating as the days pass, the invasion of time into a timeless world, revealed to us slowly, one hopes not terribly, in a bleak convergence. History, if you like. So I can assume none of this will ever see a courtroom, said Lou. Suppose there were no such thing, after all, as original sin. Suppose the serpent in the Garden of Eden was never symbolic, but a real being in a real history of intrusion from somewhere else. Say from behind the sky. Say we were perfect, we were law-abiding and clean, then one day they arrive. And this is how you explain villains and bad men among otherwise more population? Not that Lou was looking for an argument, he was genuinely puzzled. You will see it in practice. I just wouldn't want it to be too rude a surprise. So, I think some of what you're getting at, Will, is indicated there too. Suppose all of these things were real. Everything that is in the world is what it is. And that broadens out this perspective that Pynchon is getting to of, this development of the they. And very curiously, the they here has a lowercase t. And the kind of all the bad and evil that comes with it, that is just, it's there. There seems to be little we can do to get rid of it or control it, but it's important to be aware of. For me, this immediately brought up, of course, the chapter of them kind of excavating something from the ice, right? That arrival of capitalism and modernity and evil from wherever it may have been hidden or buried from, whether that be outside the world or from a parallel world or whatever it may be. It's an interesting kind of cap to this section before the page break, where the chapter gets real crazy.
It's also alluded to at the very beginning of the chapter, where you have the flip back to that page real quick. In the third paragraph, I guess technically, On the rare occasions they might actually find the article, he guessed they would have little clue about what to do besides spin around and around, trying to see what it was that had sunk its pearly whites, or in Evil's case, mossy greens, into their more or less ambushed feasters. The capitalization of evil in that sentence and the use of mossy greens rather than pearly whites, I think, kind of alludes to that sort of worldly evil that has been lurking and that has been alluded to throughout this whole, not just this book, but I mean, you can go back to Mainland and the others as well. That sort of global evil that is slowly starting to surface and to make its presence known, and that excavation may have unearthed part of it, or a sort of like an avatar of it or something like that. So it's all these little sort of foreshadowing kind of things and little bits of here's that thing coming up again is always just fun to kind of catch.
Yeah, definitely. And it Pynchon does exactly what you're talking about, or he takes exactly what you're talking about and he applies it directly to the character who, as Luke reminded us of earlier, has this sort of random sin or stain on his life that he can't remember. And so he is now in the very sort of next paragraph after the page break wondering, like, do I have it? Is it in me? How did I get it? This this concept of evil, or this concept of whatever the sin or creation is that all of this is relating back to. The other way to ask the question being, who in this was playing him for a fish? How deep was their game? If it was the TWIT itself using him for motives even more occult than they'd pretended to let him in on, this was a serious manure pile, and he'd best find his way out of it as soon as he can. This, of course, leads into Lou doing the exact opposite and like continuing down the initiation pathway, like witnessing things happening at the house and understanding that a lot of this stuff seems really strange, but there seems to be something in it that compels him. And then, of course, we get back to Yashmin Halfcourt, who he finds to be the most trustworthy of any of these people. And it's directly because it seems as though she can just see through the bullshit.
Yeah.
So to rewind a bit, on the bottom of page 222, what do y'all make of the phrase "flesh-eating sheep sailed over the fence between dreams and the day"? Because I have trouble with that phrase and like why it's there.
The only thing that I can synthesize meaning out of within that phrase is the idea that like the worst elements of society or history or all of the stuff that we've talked about, the development of modernity and the evil within capitalism and all of that is so awful that it could only come from like a fictional place like dreams or from another world or whatever, and its existence in real space or real society is akin to a dream crossing over into the reality that we live in, except it's more of a nightmare. So the sheep that you're counting when you're sleeping are actually flesh-eating sheep that in your worst possible conception of what reality could be, that's where these things come from.
So I get like a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing.
Yeah,
like a literal, yeah.
That's kind of what I feel like that makes me think of.
Yeah, that's basically what I got out of it. The idea of like, even as you do something as mundane as counting sheep as you go to sleep, you're tricking yourself into allowing these kinds of what is contained in this personally tailored portfolio of mischief are things that feel innocent.
Yeah, I like all of that. There's another passage or phrase earlier in the chapter that I'm now blanking on where it is, but there's always, almost always, at least pretty much every chapter in every pension book has phrases, at least one or two phrases like that, where it's just kind of, it seems like whenever you're reading it, you just kind of like the first couple of times I read this chapter, I just kind of glossed over that phrase. the last time I read it, I was just like, what is going on with that particular part? I do think that Pynchon kind of, he does that a good amount, and I don't always know what to make of it. Although I do like y'all's ideas.
Yeah, he's really good at an illusory phrase that makes the reader either imagine all sorts of things, or that points towards there being some more importance there. He's one of the best writers at that particular.
Yeah, that's true.
Yashmin and Lou go on a walk together, and this is when Lou, sort of believing that he can trust her more than anyone else, just sort of inquires about like what she knows. And we get a great joke here, where he says, "What do you know about Brother Nookshaft?" Lou was wondering, what was he what was he before he was a Cohen, for instance? Anything, she supposed, from a schoolmaster to a petty criminal. I don't see him as ex-military. Not enough of the indices there. Beginning with the haircut, actually. I mean, it's not exactly Trumpers, is it? Trumpers is a royal barber. Like so, just literally saying his hair is so bad, there's no way that he could have anything to do with hair care. And then she expands on to say that all of these people that fill up these lodges or these societies, they just sort of appear like out of nowhere. Who they were before doesn't really matter. It's not really relevant to what they do now or what they represent now. And then he says, "Well, that seems a little judgmental." And then she just says, "I think I've judged them pretty fairly." Which is another great joke and another just wonderful detail of her character there.
Yeah.
Do we have any thoughts on this kind of back and forth conversation that they have while walking?
I like the last paragraph, her last quote on 224, because I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how she just doesn't buy into any of this, and none of them really seem to. And she points out, on this island, she went on, as you will have begun to notice, no one ever speaks plainly. Whether it's Cockney rhyming codes or the crosswords in the newspapers, all English, spoken or written, is looked down on as no more than strings of text cleverly encrypted. Nothing beyond. Any who may come to feel betrayed by them, insulted, even hurt, even grievously, are simply taking it too seriously. The English exercise their eyebrows and smile and tell you it's irony or a bit of fun, for it's only combinations of letters after all, isn't it? That sort of idea that all of them are just basically vomiting these word salad bullshit things just to sound smart or to sound cryptic or whatever the case may be, but there's actually no meaning whatsoever in any of it. But it's all taken super seriously because it's coming from the mouths of these people. It's such a perfect encapsulation of how those kind of groups operate.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I'm jumping back to the previous quote. I'd just like to say it lines up as kind of an inversion, not really an inversion, a conversion of the dynamic of Reef in the jail cell picking up the Chums of Chance book, where these people are clearly trying to escape their past and are, instead of picking up a book where they can find a world to escape in, they are trying to shape the world around them into something that fits their taste.
Mm-hmm.
And the unserious language is just one way that they use to get away with that kind of skullduggery.
Yeah, which also like perfectly describes how these societies formed in real history as well.
Yeah,
we get some other historical sort of allusions here. One, there's a reference to Girton College in Cambridge, which was the first women's college there that opened in 1869. Lou also says next they'll be letting you folks vote, which she then says not in your lifetime, which is not true. Women over the age of 30 were given the right to vote in the UK in 1918, and then 10 years later in 1928 they gave women the right to vote rather on the same basis as men, so from age 21. And then we do also get the first reference to a Mr. Arthur Edward Waite. He is the creator of the most famous tarot deck, which is often referred to as the Rider-Waite Tarot. He'll come up multiple times over the course of this chapter. including right after the page break, where Lou is beginning to be given access to a tarot deck to deepen his understanding of it, and to presumably start to kind of make his own philosophical interpretations of it, or at least to get introduced to it as a way of learning about who these people are going to be that make up the Dicosa dyad. We get a reference to Miss Pamela Pixie Coleman Smith under the guidance of Mr. Waite. Basically, Pamela Coleman Smith illustrated all of the art on the Rider-Waite tarot. So if you're someone who either does tarot or is just familiar with it, the kind of most famous illustrations that make up kind of if there is a default tarot deck, the default tarot deck were done by her. And then Arthur Edward Waite is the person who kind of synthesized those cards together in that formation. And then from there, we get introduced to the first couple of members of the Dicosa dyad. And this is just fun pinch-on stuff. Up until we're introduced to the people who represent the devil card, and really I think plays off of a similar brand of humor as a lot of the stuff in the previous chapter in Jeshimon. Does someone want to read the paragraph starting on 225 where it describes these people, where it starts with "as if testing a new policeman on the beat"?
Sure. As if testing a new policeman on the beat, the 22 lost little time in demonstrating to Lou this nomenclatural flexibility. Temperance, number 14, proved to be an entire family, the Uckenfays, living in a disagreeable western suburb, each of whom specialized in a different pathological impulse he or she was unable to control, including litigiousness, chloral addiction, public masturbating, unexpected discharges of firearms, and, in the case of the baby Des, scarcely a year old and already 4 stone, that form of gluttony known to students of the condition as gavert du visage. As of the latest information, the Hermit, 9, was the cordial proprietor of Ardevon, where Lou soon became part of the regular clientele. The Wheel of Fortune, 10, was a Chinese opium den landlord based in the Midlands, whose life of luxury was derived from joints all over London as well as Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. The Last Judgment, 20, was a streetwalker from 7 Dials, sometimes accompanied by her pimp, and so forth. Fine with Lou, who always liked to meet new and interesting people, and the chores they brought with them by way of self-introduction were easily disposed of. But then they started coming at him in twos.
So it's just there's just some great jokes in here. That baby's 56 pounds based upon the measurement in 4 stone.
Mm-hmm.
And that condition, gavert du visage, just means stuff one's face.
Yep.
And to get into like some random tarot details, like you read some of these things and it seems as though they're inverted of what they should be. All of that, I'm sure, is serving 2 purposes. 1, just because it's funny, but then also 2, tarot cards can, in certain readings, again, all of this stuff is so up to interpretation from a perspective of how any individual person reads tarot. But there is a way to read tarot cards where the cards can either be pulled right side up or inverted. And often the inverted card is literally has a meaning that is inverted of what normally means when it's right side up. So the idea that there is this clash of the name with what you're actually seeing has some basis in how certain people do choose to read tarot cards. We also get our first reference to Madame Eskimoff. We learn that this person is going to be doing a sitting tonight, and this, of course, ends up being a seance that we get into at the end of the chapter. But we learn that there is suddenly a problem. There's an emergency situation that has arisen. And en route to the seance, the Grand Cohen explains that the emergency situation has to do with the owners of the 15th card, also known as the Devil. In particular, the Cohen went on with the 2 chained figures found at the bottom of the card, imagined by their artist Miss Coleman Smith, perhaps after Dante, as simple, naked man and woman. Though in the earlier tradition, these had been shown as a pair of demons, genders unspecified, whose fates were bound and who could not separate even if they wanted to. At present, this unhappy position amongst the major arcana was occupied by a pair of rival university professors, Renfrew at Cambridge and Werfner at Göttingen, not only eminent in their academic settings, but also would-be powers in the greater world. Years before, in the wake of the Berlin Conference of 1878, their shared interest in the Eastern question had evolved from simple bickering at a distance by way of the professional journals to true mutual loathing, implacable and obsessive with a swiftness that surprised them both. Okay. Apologies in advance, because the line Berlin Conference of 1878 sent me on a multi-day excursion through research. But we're going to start at the top with the choice to render these two folks as the devil. This is, of course, dealing with a lot of things in the book that we've already talked about, from the doubling, from the inversion. The card has these two people whose fates are sort of intertwined and chained with one another. That has a whole bunch of meaning within that same sort of paradigm that we've discussed a lot. And then, like, literally their names are inverted spellings of one another. So Pynchon is sort of really hitting home on those several ideas. The other important thing to understand is that if you go into the interpretation of tarot cards, often the devil card represents that the souls who are chained to the sort of Baphomet drawing, if you're pulling that in a tarot reading, it is often referring to the idea that someone is following their worst impulses, or that somebody is ignoring their better nature in service of things that are either self-serving or harmful. And this, of course, gets to these two professors that have been assigned this number and this card as being major players on the world stage of influencing events. And this is where we start building the case for Pynchon's writing here about the idea that the lead up to World War I and World War I as a whole and all of that is this sort of paradigm shift related to power struggles over personal interpretations of how commerce should be done, or, you know, all of the different things that I mentioned at the top of the episode that I won't sort of bore the listener with repeating here now. This, of course, leads us to what the Berlin Conference of 1878. Technically, if you want to understand the Berlin Conference, you go back to the 1600s, which was around the time that the Ottoman Empire took over the Balkan states and absorbed them into their sort of empire at its peak. Not going to go over that, but understand that the origins of the Berlin Conference technically lie there. What we get to in more relevant terms, though, is that the Berlin Congress was a meeting by the major colonial European powers to raise, erase, and change the terms of an earlier treaty, the Treaty of San Stefano, that had put an end to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. What is the Russo-Turkish War? I'm glad you asked. That war was fought by a Russian-led coalition seeking to recover territorial losses in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, free the Balkan nations from the Ottoman Empire, and establish itself in the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire, over the course of this war, was very, very quickly pushed back to the gates of Constantinople, which prompted intervention from the greater Western powers before it escalated any further. Russia claimed the provinces of the Caucasus for its own, as well as the Budyak region on the Black Sea. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro all claimed formal independence, and Bulgaria emerged as a Austria-Hungary-backed autonomous state in the wake of this war. The war itself, as I mentioned, came about as a result of a great, what they called, Eastern Crisis, in which the Ottoman Empire failed to properly govern the Balkan region of their empire. In particular, new laws imposed by the great European powers enforcing an equal treatment of Muslims and non-Muslims failing, while angering the majority Muslim population to great effect, and the need to take out costly loans to keep the empire afloat. All of these things lead to a series of uprisings in the Balkans, revolts, and atrocities across that region through the 1870s. So basically, the Ottoman Empire just like got too big, and it didn't have enough money to administer its government in the Balkan states, and it also really struggled with trying to kind of square the circle of having a majority Muslim population that is suddenly not allowed to treat the non-Muslim population the same. I say this because there was certain laws within the Ottoman Empire that were very purposely discriminatory towards the non-Muslim, Christian, and other minority populations. Just one of which was called the jizya tax, which allowed Muslims to just charge non-Muslims more money for goods and services. The Ottomans rejected a peace plan that was initially put forth by other European powers without their actual approval. So some of the great European powers basically just said like, "Hey, here's what you can do to solve the issues in your nation." And the Ottomans said, "You didn't consult us on this. We're not following it. Goodbye." From there, that erased any of the proposals at something called the Constantinople Congress, which took place in 1876. That's where these major European powers said, here's what the Ottoman Empire needs to do. And they said, we're not going to do it. This then basically made any way forward for the Balkan states and for the non-Muslim minority population of the Ottoman Empire unclear. There was no easy end to the violence that had been ongoing. There was no to the struggles that they were having. And the Ottoman Empire at this time started to be referred to as like the old man of the East, or a lot of terminology surrounded them about like that they're a dying empire, that they're sick, or that they're struggling in some way. They're no longer considered a great European power. At this point, Russia privately held talks with Austria-Hungary to ensure that they would be a silent supporter of the war. And this was something called the Reichstag Agreement. As soon as they knew that Austria-Hungary wouldn't enter the war or wouldn't punish Russia, Russia felt that it was sort of good to go, and then it could go down there and free the Balkan states and sort of reassert itself as a great European power, a great power in the world more broadly. This has a lot of implications from the perspective of what they called the Great Game, which was this idea that Britain and Russia were kind of constantly jockeying back and forth for power. But a lot of people understood that like something needed to be done. The idea that Russia was going to go down there and help free the Balkans, or at least help create a better environment for them, was actually pretty broadly popular. I don't know if you'll be able to like give a link to this, Cody, but there's a pretty cool image on the Wikipedia page that I found for this conflict that is essentially a political cartoon. That won't let me send it into Discord, unfortunately, because it's too big. But it's essentially a political cartoon that stylizes Europe and the Ottoman Empire into like fighting men, like locked in combat. And the actual drawing is called The Great Avenger, and it stylizes Russia as this bigger, stronger opponent that is going to go down into the Ottomans and beat them up, essentially. It's a really cool piece of art that I highly recommend people look up. And this was done, I believe, by a British political cartoonist. So even though they had this broader conflict with one another, this was largely seen as probably a good thing that the Russians were going to go and do. The war progressed and ended very fast. And the Ottomans were forced back to Constantinople by January of 1878. They offered Russia a truce, which was accepted underneath pressure by the British. Despite this acceptance of the truce, though, Russia and its forces continued to move in and started to threaten the sort of outer edges of the region that Constantinople presided over. And so, in order to prevent the war from escalating any further, basically a British fleet went down to San Stefano to halt the Russian forces with a blockade. This then leads us to the peace treaty of San Stefano. It was brought to the table negotiated and agreed to between Count Nicholas Pavlov Ignatiev. I'm going to be saying a lot of like Russian and sort of Balkan names over the course of this episode, and I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation of those. So it was negotiated between them and Alexander Nedviev on the Russian side, and then Safed Pasha and Sabdullah Bey. It accomplished the following things. It established the autonomous self-governing Principality of Bulgaria. They acted as a de facto independent nation, but still paid tribute to the Ottomans. The new map lines gave Bulgaria direct access to the Mediterranean, which afforded Russia the same access, which could have led to the creation of naval bases on the port. This is one of the huge things that Britain in particular greatly disliked. Montenegro more than doubled its landmass, and it got its independence recognized. Serbia gained 2 cities and became independent. Turkey recognized the independence of Romania and then gained northern Dubrovka from Russia, which they transferred to the Ottomans and gave up in exchange for southern Bessarabia. Muslims, or those who preferred the rule of the Ottomans, were allowed to sell their property and migrate to Turkey after this ended. The Armenian Straits were declared open to neutral ships in both war and peacetime. Crete, Thessaly, and Ypres got limited forms of self-government. So those are the major things that this treaty accomplished. It was considered a disaster by the great European powers who had been engaging in this, I'm going to call it a pointless struggle that was literally more or less all over sort of shipping rights, commerce, trade, and just sort of a fear that any one of them wasn't the dominant power in the world at the time. And so the reaction to this treaty was largely just fear over Russia becoming a greater power in the world. Serbia feared the establishment of a greater Bulgaria would damage its interests in other Balkan territories. Romania found themselves unsatisfied with the lack of reward for their efforts in the war. They contributed a lot of troops and forces in general. They also felt that some of Russia's advances had actually violated earlier treaties between those two nations. Austria-Hungary also disliked the treaty because it failed to expand their influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, despite them essentially giving Russia permission to start the war by agreeing not to intervene at that early treaty that I mentioned. Albania also felt particularly angered as a fair amount of their territory was lost to Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro. So very few people ended up happy with this peace treaty. With the disastrous results of the war and that treaty, only 4 months after it was signed, the greater European powers convened at the Congress of Berlin to renegotiate it, essentially. Members of the conference came from Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Great Britain, France, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, Romania, Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania. It was organized as a result of England's opposition to the Russian hegemony over the Ottoman Empire Balkans. Britain stationed their Mediterranean fleet near Constantinople to enforce British demands even after the Treaty of San Stefano was signed. And fearing a war could erupt, Otto von Bismarck was asked to mediate a solution to restore the Ottomans' ability to counterbalance Russian influence in the Balkans and the Mediterranean. So even though all of these people acknowledged that the Ottomans lost, and not just lost, were basically got the floor wiped with them in a very short amount of time, and that they had become the sick man of Europe, they still wanted to find a way to artificially prop up the Ottoman Empire in order to provide that counterbalance to Russia. This, of course, is one of the most obvious, I want to say, parallels to the modern world from a standpoint of proxy wars that countries have engaged in against communism or underneath the sort of guise of promoting democracy. This is a playbook that would get repeated all across the 1900s and is essentially still repeated now. So again, we're seeing a lot of shades of things that have continued to happen afterwards as a result of this, even though there was no reason for the Ottoman Empire to get up by the greater European powers. They were running out of money. They were doing a severely bad job of administering their empire. There was no reason for them to do this other than by denying Russia access to key shipping lanes and ports that it had wanted but lost in an earlier war. The final agreement essentially dismantled the Balkan state that had been created only 3 months prior as a result of the Treaty of San Stefano, and completely reorganized the borders of southeastern Europe. This agreement also led to the forcible occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary, the de facto annexation of Cyprus by Britain, and the formal recognition of the self-declared independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. While war was feared, it led to a deepening of the national grievances in the Balkan states and intensified the rivalry between Britain and Russia. Nobody won the Treaty of Berlin, or the Congress of Berlin. So especially looking at it from the perspective of Pynchon, this is a case where, for no reason other than these kind of petty grievances that I've already illustrated, the powers jockey against one another, and then as a result, solve nothing, cause more problems, and also lead directly to a lot of people dying. Without spending the next 9 months going over Balkan nationalism and conflicts in the Balkans that have existed there basically forever, there was a lot of nationalist tendencies that were cropping up after the Ottoman occupation, because they were essentially being, in their minds, denied their right to exist as sort of states that were distinct from what felt like a far eastern power. And so you take all of this nationalist fervor and you keep rewriting their country lines, which in some cases causes these differences in culture across one Balkan state to the other to come in contact with another, and suddenly you're just expecting those people not to acknowledge that maybe they're similar but different from one another. And you've created a powder keg, essentially, for all of these nations to just sort of accept what they're given, despite the fact that the people who are administering these agreements have nothing to do with their territory, with their people, with their history, any of that. These elements would, of course, contribute to long-term regional instability that would lead to Balkan wars in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913. And then, of course, eventually World War I. Otto von Bismarck secretly, prior to the conference, negotiated with England, and the two of them agreed on a set of agenda items that they would essentially force to come about as a result of however the negotiations went. These included complete removal of Russian influence on the Balkans. They wanted to avoid any influence there, or communication or collaboration if possible. They also wanted to make sure that the formation of a Greater Bulgaria did not happen. This gets into a lot of ideas about sort of pan-Slavism or pan-South Slavism. A lot of the southern Slavic states in the Balkans believed in what they called a Greater Bulgaria or a Greater Yugoslavia, where they would be sort of united into one people group instead of being chopped up into different places. This gets into a lot of the detail behind why World War I started that we'll get into in a little bit. Constantinople needed to remain in Ottoman hands, and they wanted to secure civil rights for Jews in the region as a precondition for the recognition of the new states that would be formed. The newly independent states were granted varying levels of independence. Romania was made fully independent from, although Bessarabia was given to Russia, and then Romania also gained northern Dobruja. Serbia and Montenegro were granted full independence, but they lost territory from the Treaty of San Stefano. Bulgaria was made semi-independent. Eastern Romania became a special administration, and Eastern Macedonia was returned to the Ottomans on the condition that they would reform their governance of it. Well, many nations afterwards essentially just propagandized and hailed the conference as a success. Basically, every participant, as I had mentioned, was unhappy with the result. The Ottomans were humiliated once again and had their weakness as a power confirmed. Russia hated the lack of reward despite the fact that they won the war and experienced more humiliation as a result of this treaty, of their initial treaty being rejected by countries who never fought in that war. Bulgaria was enraged at losing over half of the territory that was originally envisioned in the San Stefano Treaty. Pan-Slavists and Russian nationalists came to resent Bismarck for allowing this to happen. Although Austria-Hungary did gain territory, the South Slavs were angry at the loss of the previous arrangement as it made for the foundation of a South Slavic state by way of that greater Bulgarian territory. With the reversal in fortunes and Austria-Hungary's aggression in the region, decades of tension would be built in Bosnia and Herzegovina, culminating, of course, in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Festering tensions between Russia and Austria-Hungary, as well as escalating degrees of Balkan nationalism, would result in multiple Balkan wars even before Franz Ferdinand was shot in an effort to free Bosnia and Herzegovina of Austro-Hungarian rule, in an effort to reawaken the dream of a Yugoslav state. Essentially, the Congress of Berlin would set a powder keg in motion that would slowly burn until it fully ignited in World War I. Viewed through the lens of the Devil Tarot, these men's shared animosity can be seen as the manipulation of the devil, holding them back from being their best selves and working at the behest of evil that seeks to constrain them into their worst impulses. Viewed more broadly, the forces of evil are seeking to keep Europe and civilization broadly back from being its most idealized self on a track of the most destructive patterns imaginable. Okay. That's everything that goes into the one line. So that's the context behind this, and also the context behind this idea that, like, trying to break down these agreements and trying to break down the different states of countries at this time and why they were doing what they were doing. In my estimation of why Pynchon is using that in the way that he is with this dicosa dyad system, really gets the idea that, like, on paper, none of this makes any sense. On paper, this seems like people constantly shooting themselves in the foot, people constantly undermining their own interests, cutting off their nose to spite their face, or inviting greater conflict and turmoil. And so that's why I think it's sort of mapped out that way. That was a lot of detail. Hopefully my elucidation of that made sense to anyone still listening. I'm sure that some of that information that I got may be organized wrong or spoke wrong, but that is my understanding of these elements and how they relate to these characters on the page and what they're doing.
I think what you said made sense. Ignoring the fact that this is a period of time where there are like 7 different Russo-Turkic wars.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's a really good rundown of the reasons why these two, like, nationalities are being epitomized in Renfrew and Werfner.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll get this out of the way now so I don't have to say it going forward. I really hate the Renfrew and Werfner stuff in this book.
Oh, really?
We're gonna have a lot of opportunities to talk about them in the next couple chapters, and
okay,
just apologizing that I will have very little to say. But I think all of that historical context is really important, because that is really these like driving notions that really have, like you said, have nothing to do with reason. It's not about like these individuals hating each other or about this war being a good thing. It's all of these entangled interests pushing people in a single direction, even if they don't necessarily want it.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. And of course, Pynchon includes that phrase of the Great Game, just so that in case you're sort of not aware of what that means, you can go and research it. And then he's got a quote that kind of ends this section before continuing on that I like, where it says, as Werfner put it, perhaps built into the nature of time, added Renfrew, Howsoever, over their cloistering walls and into the map of the megacosm, the two professors continued to launch their cadres of spellbound familiars and enslaved disciples. Some of these found employment within the foreign service, others in international trade, or as irregular adventurers assigned temporarily to their nation's armed navies, all sworn to loyalties in whose service they were to pass through the greater world like spirit presences, unsensed by all but the adept. So that's essentially Pynchon saying what you just said, Will, from the perspective of these people acting seemingly in no logical but interest. And of course, I think this is where Pynchon is developing this idea of the creation of the capital T they. That's what I've sort of annotated next to that quote. That after that, these people get put into special agencies and special services where they're able to kind of push for what someone thinks is the right way to go. And of course, this gets into the idea that all of this sets up World War I. World War I sets up World War II. Pynchon's got a whole book about that. And then out of World War II, you get intelligence services, and you get a lot of the kind of conspiratorial elements of the capital T they, and of nation building, and of subterfuge, and everything that happens in that post-World War II world through the Cold War and communism, and to interventions in South America, and everything that we covered and talked about in Vineland, and then also in Bleeding Edge, and then all of that sort of culminates into the world that Pynchon has been describing over the course of his books. So it's important stuff. I wish he did it in a little bit of a different way than this, because I struggle to understand how he couldn't have come up with a way to build this idea a little bit more gradually, or to introduce concepts with some more explanation so that the reader doesn't have to go and like rack their brain with all of that stuff. And I haven't even gotten to the assassination of the Serbian king yet.
I kind of get the sense that this chapter might have been initially drafted way back in the 70s. Like it does feel like older Pynchon, or younger Pynchon, but old Pynchon does feel like that kind of obsession with like putting it all into one neat package just to do it, that he delighted in with Gravity's Rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very true. Any other thoughts on all of that historical stuff before we get to Natalia Eskimoff?
I just, on a side note, want to on the show, because I don't think we've brought this up before, like actually in an episode, but I just want to thank you, Kate, for doing all of this research. Like genuinely, this is like, I'm at a point in my life where I don't have time to do this research. Like I just can't devote that sort of energy to it. And so for you to really do that hard work and bring it into the show in a digestible, understandable, and contextual sense, just really, I think, helps at least myself, and I know Will and Luke have mentioned it as well. But I think it adds so much to the reading and helps kind of me as someone without that time to have that information provided to me in a nice, neat little package. So thank you.
Hey, you're welcome.
You do a really good job. So we all appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Especially with this book being the one that I have not read, and being in the position of like doing a show on it, I've devoted that much time to it because I do want to understand it in a way that we can kind of communicate it to the audience. Because as we have mentioned, like the amount of secondary sources for this particular book of his are slim to none.
Yeah.
And the amount of coverage devoted to it is certainly minor in comparison to a lot of his greater works. And I think this chapter is a good example of why, because to fully build all of this stuff, a knowledge base for yourself and to support the text, it takes a lot. But I also am finding it very worthwhile and gratifying for the actual reading that I'm doing of it. I feel like if I had read this book before the show had been done, I don't think that I would have understood it as well as I do so far. I would say that these 200 pages of Pynchon, 232 pages of Pynchon are among the 232 that I actually understand the best as a result of doing the show and like going through all of that stuff.
Well, and I think just to make it clear, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Just didn't want to be the one who didn't. But the point the point of all your research, like all of these things, when you pull up the actual historical evidence and you line it up with what's going on in this chapter, it really does get at the broader what I think is often misframed in terms of like discussion of why people enjoy Pynchon and authors like him. It's often misjudged as like, oh, you're enjoying the Wikipedia aspect of you see a thing and either you're presented with a new corner of the world that you weren't aware of, and you get that, in modern parlance, a flash of dopamine from all that potential information that you get a glimpse at, or like, oh, so I know a thing. This thing is in my brain too. Yay! But it really is that much more nuanced. Like, whether you want to take the particular interpretation that you drew from it, Kate, or which I do agree with broadly, when you contextualize his books and his individual sections of books with their historical content, you see that he's making these, again, regardless of specific conclusions drawn by each reader, he's creating these incredibly nuanced arguments about how to interpret the past, that if you were to write them in a non-narrative fiction form, would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages just establishing the background before you get to the standpoint of like actually walking through the psychology or the philosophy or the whatever specific reasoning you're going to be using to interpret those series of historical facts.
Yeah, very true. And I think like what you've just said gets to the kind of the stuff that we talked about a lot in the season we did for Crying of Lot 49, where if we're looking at Crying of Lot 49 as in part a statement on who he wants his readers to be, that he wants his readers to be these filterers of information, or these people looking for symbols or signs to interpret and understand what they mean. That I think is a great sort of reinforcing point to why you should do this with his books, or why he writes these books in the way that he does. All of which brings us to Madame Natalia Eskimoff. What do we, before we get into the references character, what I want to ask Luke A, as someone who has talked about having an interest in Kabbalah in the past because of the fact that she has the Tree of Life symbolized, what your thoughts are on the Tree of Life as it stands within Kabbalah, then also what our more broadly for the other three of you, what we think of the character.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I have any specific thoughts. I have, it has occurred to me that a Kabbalah Tree of Life tattoo, like on my back or something, like a big piece, would be really cool. I would never actually get it done for a bunch of different reasons. The main one is, that I'm not Jewish. And as much as interested as I am in Kabbalah, I wouldn't call myself a Kabbalist, Kabbalist or whatever. It's a really cool tattoo idea. As it's, I mean, I am interested, I guess, in the Tetractus and its interplay with the Kabbalah Tree of Life, Kabbalistic Tree of Life. I don't know enough about because it's the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. It's arranged differently than the Tetractus is, and but it is, I think, also numbered. But yeah, that's about all I have to say about that. In particular, I do like her character a good amount, at least so far. She seems pretty interesting. And she does seem she's probably the character that would fit in the easiest into Gravity's Rainbow so far, I would say. Just to bring it back to Gravity's Rainbow again, with the Tree of Life tattoo and just kind of her general aura that I get from her in this book. She would fit right into some of the London sections in Gravity's Rainbow in a way that other characters maybe wouldn't as well.
I hadn't thought about that, but I like that. That's a good idea to chew on. I don't really have much to say about her. I mean, I love the description of her character in this paragraph. What I really love the most is the absolute tone shift that takes place at the end of the first sentence. Madame Natalia Eskimoff's rooms ran to Mamluk lamps and draped fabrics and Indian prints, smoke rising from elaborate brass incense burners, furniture of carved big wood, and odd corners that seemed designed to warn off all but the most unfrivolous of seekers. And Lou was enchanted right away, for the lady herself was just a peach. I love it. It's just such a great little, such beautiful and eloquent writing, and she's just a peach.
I don't think much about her, but what I do think is that as a contrast to the Grand Cohen, she is an interesting alternative because like as much as the Cohen doesn't seem to be like full of shit, I guess. He's definitely not a very serious character. Whereas she, by the end of this chapter, I really get the impression that however much charlatanry is going on, she is actually trying to be as honest as she can within the strictures of something as absurd as a Neo-Pythagorean cult.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that she is misrepresenting herself, at least
just a little bit,
partially.
Yeah. You don't have to be honest about who you are to be honest with what you say.
Yeah, that's true. Just as like a brief statement on the Tree of Life, it is somewhat related to the Tetractys in the sense that both of them kind of have an outline pyramid for I'm going to just broadly say the soul. I know that is kind of a reduction of what these things are, but you can look up the actual diagram. It basically has 10 circles on it that, as Luke did mention, they have both words and numerical meanings. That gets into a lot of like Hebrew mysticism in general, because each Hebrew letter has a numerical value associated with it. And the idea is that it is sort of a mystical representation of the Tree of Life in Eden. And in this case, I can tell you that the actual nodes on that relate to crown, wisdom, intelligence, mercy, judgment, beauty, lasting endurance, majesty, foundation of the world, and then kingdom. So the idea within some of the more mystical elements of Judaism points to the idea that within the Tree of Life is basically everything, and it can be broken down into those nodes. That's a very I'll say reductionist explanation. You could spend the rest of your life studying Kabbalah. In fact, there are plenty of people who do, but that is it is somewhat related in what it's trying to articulate to the Tetractys. And is another example of, again, these blendings of a lot of different mythologies or religions or spiritual ideas, especially pulling from Hebrew religion in particular. As we are introduced to her and to the fact that she is a ceremonial magician who conducts these seances, we get a real fucking crazy paragraph on page 228, just from the perspective of all of the different things that it references. So this paragraph, which does someone want to read it? The paragraph at the top of 228, starting with "looked into closely."
I got it right here.
Okay.
Looked into closely in her time by both by Sir Oliver Lodge and Sir William Crooks. She had taken transatlantic lines to Boston to visit Mrs. Piper, traveled to Naples to sit with Eustaphia Palladino, whom she was later to defend against charges of fraud at the infamous Cambridge experiments, could indeed said to have attended some of the most celebrated seances of the day, the list of which was about to include one arranged by the ubiquitous and outspoken Mr. W.T. Stead, at which the medium Miss Burchell would witness in great detail the assassination of Alexandra and Draga Obrenović, Jesus, the king and queen of Serbia 3 months before it even happened. She was known to the TWIT as an ecstatica, a classification enjoying apparently somewhat more respect than a common medium.
Okay.
Paragraph is chock full of historical people.
Is it ever? So starting with Oliver Lodge, he was an English physicist who helped develop radio communication. He was also a pioneer of spiritualism and access to life after death, basically. He speculated on that a lot and tried to cross those barriers in some of the ceremonial stuff he did. His most famous work in that regard was a book containing detailed messages that he received from a medium, which he believed to be messages from his son, who had been killed in World War I. He would serve as president of the Society for Physical Research from 1901 to 1903. So, rolling back around to one of the other societies mentioned at the beginning. Sir William Crookes was a pioneer of vacuum tubes. He also discovered thallium and was attracted to spiritualism as a result of his studies in radiometry. He also served as president of the Society for Physical Research in the 1890s. He also served as president of the Theosophical Society and the Ghost Club from 1907 to 1912, and had been initiated into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1890. So this is where Pynchon is pulling people who have real measurable impact on our understanding of technology, communication, chemistry, and showcasing that these people, despite making these big advances, were not, I guess, what we would maybe call like rational, like atheistic thinkers. They all had this sort of ceremonial magic or spiritual bend to them that we normally wouldn't associate with people who make inventions like that. So going back to what I had kind of mentioned at the top of the episode, it's this idea of this gap bridging and how this was sort of the last period where that was present. We also get a mention of Eusapia Palladino in here. She was a very early medium who was caught cheating a lot, is the easiest way for me to describe the person. As a lot of this sort of spiritualism increased in popularity, so too did skepticism of it, and so too did people trying to disprove these seances or rituals. Harry Houdini, actually, if you read into his history, was a big part of early skepticism and early sort of investigations against all of this stuff. So she is someone who was an early medium who was constantly constantly defrauded other people. Miss Piper, that random reference, I couldn't find like a full like article on this person, but is also another sort of early medium from this period. And then we get into the last chunk of the paragraph, which is this seance organized by a Mr. W.T. Stead, at which the medium Mrs. Burchell would witness in great detail the assassination of Alexander and Draga Obrenović. This is actually a real seance. I was able to find a like excerpt from a history book on this whole period where they describe that this happened, essentially. It doesn't make a case for it being real, that she actually witnessed the assassination, but from a perspective of who the actual medium was, and then also who organized it, and then what they are reported to have seen, or purported to have seen, all of that actually does have a basis in evidently an event that did happen. Apparently this Mrs. Burchell was like regionally famous in England at the time for being a medium. The actual seance and what she is reported to have seen refers to something called the May coup, which was an uprising that took place between June 10th and 11th of 1903. The organizer of it, this individual known as W.T. Stead, was a well-known pioneer of investigative journalism in England. He most famously published a series of articles which led to the passing of a bill that raised the age of consent from 13, gross, to 16, marginally less less bad. His method and ways of journalism paved the path for the modern tabloid in England, and he was once known as the most famous journalist in the empire. His work is still seen as an early example of how press can be used to influence public opinion, and he wrote extensively over his career on child welfare, social legislation, and criminal code reform. He also died in the Titanic sinking.
I saw that.
Yeah. So, it again, another one of these instances of a person from like a powerhouse institution, in this case journalism, still had these beliefs in magic, and despite that, was pushing for social reform, and actually did use his sort of station in life to make big strides forward in the country. So now we get to what the May coup is, and again, I'm sorry for the fact that I'm about to talk for a while. But as I mentioned, this is something that happened between June 10th and 11th of 1903. After the Berlin Conference gave Serbia its independence back, King Milan of Serbia relied on an alliance with Austria-Hungary as a method of opposition to Russia over their support of Bulgaria at the Treaty of San Stefano. He became an unpopular ruler due to military defeats and a failure to suppress an uprising by the People's Radical Party, who worked to separate the monarchy from governance. After a new, highly liberal constitution was adopted, King Milan abdicated the throne in favor of a regency set up to support his eventual heir once he came of age, King Alexander I. The radicals were allowed back into the country after a banishing, and they were able to successfully form a new government after a round of popular elections, seeking to release or to basically relapse their prior pro-Austrian sentiments by allying themselves with Russia. A deal that was struck on the basis of Tsar Alexander III promising not to allow the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So again, this gets back to some of the detail from what happened after the Berlin Conference. Ultimately, that radical government lost power to a liberal party whose subsequent conduct caused great discontent among the general populace. At this time, King Alexander I declared himself of age, ended the regency that had been governing since his father's abdication, and called the radicals back to office. Now, before I get into what happens next, there is something inherently Pinchonian in its comedy of what I'm about to describe to you, from the absurd level of alliance switching to government coups to just sort of general absurdity. So just sort of buckle up, because while I had been reading about this for, I think, 3 hours by the time that I was done, a lot of it started to take on a real comedic tone towards the end, where if this guy didn't know that he was going to get assassinated by somebody, he might be the dumbest person to ever sit on a throne, maybe at any point in history. So here we go. Almost at once, Alexander I began ruling through military power. He abolished the new constitution that had just been passed and conducted another political coup which pushed the radicals back to being an opposition party, much of which came as a direct result of Alexander I inviting his father back into the country from self-imposed exile. A new progressive government was formed, and Alexander I went to Vienna to solidify ties with Austria-Hungary. So we're switching again. These relations would not last long, however, as Alexander chose to marry Draga. I don't know how to pronounce this particular S with the character above it, so I'm going to say Mason, who was not of royal blood. The active government all resigned in protest, and this led Alexander and Serbia back into the arms of Russia, as Tsar Nicholas II gave assent to the marriage and agreed to be Alexander's best man at his wedding. In an attempt to smooth things over, Alexander I pardoned all of the political prisoners that he himself had recently jailed, and formed a new radical-led government that consisted of a coalition of both radicals and liberals working in concert. He also instituted a new constitution, which divided the legislature into an upper and lower house, and gave the monarch the right to appoint a majority of the senators in both houses. After making up a rumor, and this is the craziest thing, after making up a rumor that Queen Draga was pregnant, which wasn't possible because she had been sterile since she was very young, and Alexander knew about that. The Russian Tsar decided to rescind an invitation for an official state visit from the king and queen. Alexander blamed the soured relations with Russia on the radical political party, so he instigated a new political coup and a new government on November the 6th, 1902, that was led by the military. In order to ally back with Austria-Hungary again, he agreed to solve the successor question by adopting a descendant of the Obrenoviches in Austria. This was met with open dissatisfaction and rebellion, resulting in 6 deaths and the king declaring 2 coups in the government within an hour, the first of which abolished the new constitution and the newly formed houses of the legislature. The second reinstituted both, allowing new actions and a new government to be formed, with the hand of the king guiding the process on May 18th, 1903. A plot for assassination was believed to have started as early as 1901, then also had at least 2 unsuccessful attempts before they were successful. The plot was largely led by young military officers, one of whom was actually Queen Draga's ex-husband, another of whom was an officer in the marital procession of the king's wedding. This guy's name is important. It's Dragutin Dmitrievich Api, I'm going to say is how that's pronounced. On the night of the assassination, troops were led into the palace by the guard on duty, but any attempt to find the king and queen were unsuccessful. In the ensuing fights that occurred, as loyalists discovered that rebels had broken into the royal palace, Api took 3 bullets, but somehow survived. The plot was initially thought to be basically a failure because they couldn't find the king and queen. They broke into the royal bedroom. They actually blew the doors off with dynamite, but they weren't able to find them. From here, accounts differ on where they actually found them. Some say that they were eventually found cowering behind a mirror. Some say that they were found in a wardrobe. And another account says that they were basically discovered hiding in secret passageways that had been built into the royal palace as a means of escape should something like this happen. Eventually, when they were found, they were shot and killed. Over the following days, loyalists to the monarchy were also found, killed, or imprisoned, and an interim government was established as the rebels were unable to secure an heir in cooperation with either Austria-Hungary or Russia. So at this point, they don't have a great power allied with them at all, and neither of them really want anything to do with them. So from there, the reactions to the coup, rather, were mixed, and after a series of elections and a lack of international support spurred another change in government. So already this interim government has basically left power. The conspirators were forced out of the military and were punished for their actions by a new king that they eventually were able to put into power. The one catch with this, though, is that new king and that new government didn't actually kill any of these people. They didn't even really imprison most of them. A lot of the members of the coup were just forced into retirement, is essentially what they did. But not all of them. In fact, our key figure, Api, was actually given the rank of colonel and then was given the post of serving as an intelligence officer in the Serbian military. These actions were seen as a sufficient punishment, though, for the people who were forced into retirement by the greater European allies and powers to finally open up trade with them and work with them again. And so, on behalf of the new government, the greater Europe powers, like I said, opened up relations with them again. However, as a result of all of this, and the resulting instability after the coup had happened, an organization known as the Black Hand had gained a significant amount of popularity in the country and had also gained a significant amount of membership and subsequently a significant amount of control over the direction of politics in the minds of the average Serbian. So much so that they couldn't be denied, and they also were too big and too influential to just be jailed. And so the new government, the new king, just kind of let it go. This sort of like newly forming terrorist organization that was in their midst. Now, if you know who the Black Hand is, it's probably because they were related to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Black Hand was essentially a secret military society formed by officers of the army of the Kingdom of Serbia. And the leader of the Black Hand at this time was Dragutin Dmitrievich, aka AP, as I've called him a couple of times now. So through his sort of survival of all of the kind of soft punishment for the coup, he gets put in charge of the organization, and he is the one who orders the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as retaliation for the violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina that was not able to be stopped by the earlier machinations of the Serbian government. That assassination was, of course, carried out by Gavrilo Princip, who was a member of something called Young Bosnia. And Young Bosnia was a group of radicals who supported this idea for a pan-Slavic state or a South Slavic state. And they believed that if they assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand or found a way to push Austria-Hungary out of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then they could push towards that pan-Slavic state that I already talked extensively about in the information about the Berlin Conference. And of course, all of this launches World War I.
Can't forget to mention that the Black Hand may be the closest thing to historically confirmed thing akin to the Tristero.
Very true.
Otherwise, thank you. Lots of good information there.
What a wild story. Like genuinely, that is just, there's so much. It's one of those things where the what is it, the reality is weirder than fiction kind of situation.
Yeah, truth is stranger than fiction.
Truth is stranger. Thank you. Yeah.
It really feels like a child running between its mother and father asking for permission to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just failing to get that permission, but it just keeps trying until eventually another kid in the family takes all of its candy and in the process lights the house on fire. So that is what is being witnessed at this seance, so to speak. And then from there, the kind of meeting begins in earnest, where they take up the Parsons short oxytophone and play back the wax cylinder that supposedly allows Madame Eskimoff to communicate with this person from beyond the grave. Before I get into the Baghdad Railway, which is another thing, do we have any thoughts on this this scene more broadly?
Just another tiny mention that this obsessive recording stuff is very reminiscent of what would go into Scientology.
That's a good point.
Yeah, whereas here they're talking with past lives in another realm. Scientology, they're trying to talk to past lives within yourself. That for the least crazy way to frame it, I guess.
That might be the most elegant way I've heard that framed, actually.
Yeah, it might be.
And of course, we have our link back to the Golden Dawn and all of that, because L. Ron Hubbard was kicking around with Aleister Crowley for a while before he founded Scientology.
The man too crazy for Crowley.
Yeah, which is just, it's just how. if you guys want to hear more about that in particular, I'd highly recommend you read Russell Miller's book Barefaced Messiah, which is a unauthorized biography of L. Ron Hubbard that the church blocked publication of legally in the U.S. for like 20 years before it became available. So that past life that they're communicating with is said to be a soldier who fought in that Russo-Turkish War, and is a reference, and it has a reference here to the Baghdad Railway concession. I promise this is not going to be as long as the other historical pieces that I've already talked about. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was started in 1903 to connect Berlin to the then Ottoman city of Baghdad, where the Germans had hoped to establish a port on the Persian Gulf, which would have allowed the Germans to bypass the French-British-controlled Suez Canal and the subsequent like tariffs and duties that were involved in trying to use that canal for commerce. But the railway was interrupted by the outbreak of World War I, and it would actually postpone its completion until 1940. So they started this process when the century was pretty new, and then didn't finish until it was almost half over. In addition to bypassing the Suez Canal, the railway would have given Germany access to a series of suspected oil fields in Mesopotamia. The Ottomans were in support of the railway, as it would have been a counterbalance to the Khedivate of Egypt, which had come underneath British control after the Urabi Revolt, which threatened Ottoman interests in the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea. In modern historical studies, the railway has become an icon of the imperial power struggles that led to World War I, especially if the railway had proved to be dangerous to Russia, as well by exerting German economic influence into the then Russian-controlled northern Persia and Caucasian frontier. Many historians also believe that the opposition to the railway and its postponement at the start of the war was what led to the Ottoman-German alliance, which would then underpin one of the major alliances in World War I. It would be written into the Treaty of Versailles that the railway would become owned by France, along with the 25% ownership stake of the Turkish petroleum company. Sorry, I'm going to take that line again. It would be written into the Treaty of Versailles that the railway would become owned by France, along with the 25% ownership stake of the Turkish petroleum company that the German government would own if things had gone a different way. So again, this gets into another one of these just dumb political jockeyings that was taking place, where Germany wanted to get a little bit out from underneath the thumb of Britain and France. And so they thought that a good way to do this would be to bypass some of these commerce routes in the same way that Russia was wanting to do as a result of winning the Russo-Turkish War. And Britain said, no, we can't do that. And the only reason why that didn't erupt into war is because an entirely different war started after the Black Hand ordered the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And it just, again, like Will smartly sort of condensed all of this information down to, it's just things being done for no reason or little reason or difficult to discern reasons across the entire sort of geopolitical scale, and how all of these things lead to and surround a conflict as deadly and dire to the world at large at the time as World War I was. This also has to do with, the things that the book is talking about in terms of the kilometric guarantees for building that railway. This railway was seen as so important to the Ottoman Empire if they could get it done, that they were just willing to pay out obscene amounts of money for the contractors who were going to lay down the track, to the point that a lot of the actual tracks would actually go off into nowhere, or would be built in ways that were like deliberately not the quickest route to the line that it was trying to build, just because they would get more money out of it. So again, looking at these developments of commerce and how that oppresses the best possible version of the world, or best possible society that could have come out of all of this. Really, really interesting stuff. And as it mentions here, he specializes in the Ottoman territories, which is where Renfrew and Werfner have often found their best opportunities for mischief. Yep. all of the alliances between the Ottoman empires and different empires or different countries, or the use of the Ottoman Empire as a cudgel against another country or to try and prop it up. The book is exactly correct. The Ottomans were essentially a pawn in almost everyone's game at this point in the world, or in world history. So very clearly drawing those lines between real history and kind of the alternate history that Pynchon is writing there. And then the book, this is one case where the book does kind of illustrate some of that to you in the following paragraph, which is great. But as far as some of these specific alliances and things like that, it doesn't quite do what I wanted to try and add to. And then, of course, that paragraph ends with the line, the entire geopolitical matrix would acquire a new and dangerously unverifiable set of coefficients. That seems to be a pretty good allusion to World War I in my.
This is one of those things that is deep in the fathoms of my memory, that there's like an OG conspiracy theory, like so OG that I worry that it's one of those like protocols of the elders of Zion type things.
Oh, sure.
But like that the Black Hand was hired in a direct attempt to kill the deal, that there was no actual, like, obviously there was some degree of Serbian and Bosnian and Yugoslavian in general sovereignty being pushed for by the people, but also that was the actual thing that brought the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was that simple.
Yeah, the idea that they couldn't stop, and they did try. Like, if you go and actually like read through the history of the railway, they tried, like Britain, Austria-Hungary, all those major powers tried stopping this railway a number of different ways through the methods that had worked in the past with things like the Berlin Conference. So, as with most conspiracy theories, it won't be verifiable, but like the logic in a very conspiratorial way is there to point to the idea of, we can't let the railway happen. What can we do to pause the railway? Well, you can start a war.
So what you're saying is Archduke Ferdinand was not assassinated because he was making Obama jokes at a tavern. I just want to make sure I'm clear on that.
If only. If he had been killed back
Right.
then, who knows what would have happened instead.
Right.
Well, as an aside, I think Gavrilo Princip had like actual personal beef with him. So like I think it might have actually come
I
down
do
to
think
that.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, like it was a genuine personal distaste from Princip's standpoint. So it might have been both. You get the money for the gun and the grenade, in order to try to stop the railway. But hey, might as well go and kill the guy after you failed twice in a row, because fuck him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and plus, if you have tuberculosis in the early 1900s, you don't have much of a life expectancy anyway.
Yeah.
So all of this seance basically points to the idea that like something's going on with this railway. We don't exactly know what. It isn't totally clear from the cylinder they listen to. Let's go ahead and check in on the professors to see what it is that they may be planning. And so this is where kind of the chapter leads towards its ending. Which, yes, if you've been following along diligently, we're getting close to the end of this chapter, where basically the TWIT and the Grand Cohen says, like, who do we have currently trailing the professors? Let's go ahead and check in and see what they might be planning. Before we get into the like what at first feels like a random aside to the Victorian era, any other thoughts on all of that stuff that we've talked about before we get to this last page?
I'm not really sure what can be added to it. It was very thorough.
I suppose it's important, just for the summing of it all together, that there is this aside about the way that these hauntings seem to be following along non-living beings.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have anything particular to pull out of that, but it is very much like it's just in the middle of all this historical context, you just get this burst of random like, I don't know what to call it. political philosophy, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. So from there, we sort of have this aside that takes place once the kind of seance is over, where they take out a cake and they take out some whiskey, and the Grand Cohen starts speaking about the Victorian age, and he starts talking about it in relation to an attempted assassination on Queen Victoria that took place, which is like pretty strange. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that like there's a grand history of people trying to assassinate, a fair number of these monarchs in history, but I didn't know that there was 7 unconnected assassination attempts on Queen Victoria, all of which failed. And he picks one in particular here in reference to Edward Oxford's pistol shots, and if they'd found their mark on Constitution Hill, where the history here is that Edward Oxford was a would-be assassin of Queen Victoria, who often exhibited sudden, violent, or erratic behavior, which led him to serially lose jobs in pubs. I believe on Wikipedia it says like 9 different jobs had fired.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And then after the last of those firings, in April of 1840, he went out and bought a pair of pistols. He also, separately from practicing the pistol shooting, decided to invent a secret society that had no members of itself, but that had a charter, had a fake president, had a series of like ceremonies and rules, officers, rant, like the whole sort of kit and caboodle of secret societies. He just made all this up, and then also attributed all of the documentation to different supposed members of his secret society. And this organization he called Young England. Then he decides to make his attempt on the Queen's life. She leaves the palace in an open-topped carriage, and he steps out when they drive past him. He fires one of his pistols, misses completely, and then this is one of my favorite details. He says, "I have got another," and then pulls out another pistol, fires, misses that one. And then at this point, enough people would gather to watch this sort of night drive that the Queen went on, that a scuffle unfolds. And then the guy who initially took both of the pistols from Edward Oxford starts to be apprehended, and as the crowd assumes that he was the would-be assassin. Then, for reasons that I cannot come up with the logic for, Edward Oxford then decides that out of fear of not getting credit, he is going to claim that he claims he's the person who fired the shots. And
the
then
first instance of main character syndrome.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And then he is apprehended, jailed, and interrogated by the police. And at this point, his whole fake secret society is discovered. The documents of it are discovered in his lodging, and he gets interrogated by the police over that. And they believed that he would have been from one of a couple of organizations. They later, of course, figured out that he was not a member of any of these, but the guesses were that he was one of the following subversive groups, including the Chartists, which were young working class peoples pushing for work reform, the German government, as an assassination would have ended up putting a German on the throne, the person that the Grand Cohen mentions in his monologue, or the Orange Order within the Tories, which, of course, the Grand Cohen is about to make a direct reference to. Of course, he was not a member of any of those, and then by the time that the investigation and interrogations concluded, he was given the option of voluntary exile. So he went off and settled in Australia, where he became an author, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a weird story from history that I had never heard of before.
Yeah, and I have to think that Pynchon chose this specifically because of how wild it is. It's very Pynchonian. It reminded me of the scene in Mason and Dixon with the fire. I'm trying to blank on the specifics of it right now, but there was that big kerfuffle when there was a house fire, and it was all based on a real event where somebody was trying to pull somebody else out of the house or something. I have to go back and look at it.
Oh, are you
You
talking
know what I'm talking about?
the thing where they kept crossing like borderlines?
Yes, the borderline
Yeah.
dispute during the fire. Yeah.
Yep.
The craziness of it just reminded me of that. And then also, I don't know if you saw this on his. I was doing some research on him as well. So despite all of this, despite the just insanity of the whole thing of like everything that had gone up to this point, when he's interrogated, he says, and I'm quoting this from the interrogation, "A great many witnesses are against me. Some say I shot with my left, others with my right. They vary as to the distance. After I had fired the first pistol, Prince Albert got up as if he would jump out of the coach and sat down again as if he thought better of it. Then I fired the second pistol. That's all I have to say at the moment." So he basically was like, "Yeah, I was shooting. I'm not going to say I was shooting at anybody, but I sure as hell was shooting."
Interestingly, there are some overlaps with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in this little bit of history that I found. Both were attempted at a time that the target was riding in an open carriage. Both were carried about by groups claiming a name with Young as their title. So Oxford invented Young England, and then of course Gavrilo Princip was a member of Young Bosnia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of that necessarily matters in the broad scheme of things, but just weird historical coincidences between the two of them.
Yeah.
So after making this reference, the Grand Cohen then begins to elucidate like this alternate history of the country that he sees if this had happened. This widely despised German gets put on the throne, and then suddenly all of the neighborhoods change over to being administered by Orange Lodges. This is my last bit of history that I have to go through for the chapter. Orange Lodges, or the Loyal Orange Institution, is a Protestant fraternal order based in Northern Ireland, primarily funded by Ulster Protestants. They are an ethno-religious group made up of citizens in the Irish province of Ulster. The order was founded during a period of Protestant Catholic conflict between the 1780s and 90s in Ireland that swore to uphold Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. The order is a British unionist organization opposed to Irish nationalism and republicanism and opposed to Scottish independence. They are politically conservative. They have also been historically responsible for much of the fighting that would come to define the lines between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, and they actually enjoyed a resurgence in the 1880s after gaining the backing of several landlords and have publicly been declared as the society that alone is capable of dealing with the condition of anarchy and rebellion which prevail in Ireland at the time in the 1880s. As these troubles continued in the 1880s, the order continued to support the rights of landlords over their tenants, and the group shifted to a policy of antagonism towards laws proposed that would allow tenants to buy out the landlords at a fixed price. So it seems to me that Pynchon is making a pretty obvious choice in saying that all the neighborhoods are being administered by these orange orders, and also that, again, developing into this broader theme of like the old world is gone, the new world is here, and that new world is like pretty bad, and also is primarily serving the interests of capital. You have this political order that literally gains popularity by choosing to support the rights of landlords over individual people, and that uses that as a method to kind of divide what would otherwise be pretty popular movements. And then, of course, that has historical roots that extend through the 1900s with all of the continued fighting that happened there into today with still those boundary lines between Ireland and then Northern Ireland. And we also get the reference here of another sort of calendar change, being that a grim sort of counter Christmas runs from the 1st to the 12th of July, and anniversaries of the Boyne and Aughrim. These are reference to the Willamite War, which was a period of fighting in Ireland that led to a Protestant victory in the Ulster counties and over the Catholics in England, or in Ireland rather. That whole thing is a whole nother can of worms unto itself that I think would extend past what is necessary to maybe go over for the purpose of this chapter. But the point being that the Grand Cohen is trying to elucidate again this sort of alternate England, or this sort of alternate history, and that everything that happens in this world is so much worse, and it's so much worse in a kind of a point blank way. Like, everyone's unhappy, everyone knows why they're unhappy. There's a lot of interesting stuff that gets mentioned over the course of this monologue up until the end, and then it just sort of gets undercut by him saying, "Oh, it's all such a joke." And then Luke, at the beginning of the episode, it kind of mentions that it doesn't seem to fit very well within this chapter. To me, and this is maybe it's Conspiracy Corner, maybe it's just a theory, and I'd love to, of course, hear the rest of your guys' thoughts on why the chapter ends this way and what they're all sort of getting into here. To me, what the Cohen is actually pointing out is, like, this is how bad the world actually is at this point, but it isn't blatant. It's not in your face. It isn't literally like the law of the land that the Orange Orders, administer the neighborhoods or whatever. But that effectively it is this. You just don't know the people doing it. The landlords still have the power. The sort of tyrannical forces or evil forces still have control. You may just not know who they are, and you may not know what they're pushing towards. But the world is as bad as what it is that I've described. But it might be worse in the sense that you just don't know who they are. You don't have a face to the name. And so as a result, it seems not as bad because you don't have a direct person to blame or a direct sort of antagonistic force to point towards. And it's kind of there as a way to prompt Lou to think about what it is that he's stepping into from a perspective of the world. Like, if you continue with us, the veils are going to be taken off your eyes, so to speak, and you're going to see that, like, this is the world you're living in, although it might be served up a little bit differently, and you have to work harder to see it. That's what I kind of take out of the ending of this chapter. What do you guys think of it?
I think you're spot on. I think that it's exactly a case of, like you mentioned, the idea that, yeah, there is evil in the world, but you don't really know the truth behind it. Kind of like it's like a Wizard of Oz thing, right? Like, you don't really understand the full goings on behind the curtain. And in this situation in particular, what's behind the curtain is unfathomably terrifying. And you can certainly understand more of it, if not, maybe not all of it, but you can certainly understand more of it, but it's going to come at a price, and you're going to have to earn the ability to see that. But once you take those steps, there is no going back. Like, it's that removal of naivety that kind of comes with various, different points in your life at which you kind of like with the pension books, like they all take place around this cultural zeitgeist, this societal change, this political movement that occurs, and from which there's no going back. Once we've crossed that Rubicon, so to speak, that's it. And so this is kind of a warning to Lou of, like, yeah, you kind of know, but if you really want to know, we can show you how you can find out. But once you know, like, how the sausage is made, that's it. Like, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Well, I've got some differing, but I think convergent ideas about this rambling.
I'd love to hear it.
Because I think ultimately, as far as what's like the content of the chapter, I think that is a solid reading of it. I'm not convinced that the Cohen is as lucid of a thinker as y'all are giving him credit for.
You have a point.
But not necessarily even to say that he's an idiot or not trying to say these kinds of things, but more in the sense that I think there are like these two other ways of looking at this passage in the context of the book. There's the looking at it as Victoria as a simple not metaphor, metonymy, I guess, as synecdoche for the British Empire, and basically just talking about the idea of these. Victoria has shaped it in this particular set of circumstances, but when you scrape away the Victoria, like you said, nothing changes. However, Victoria, being the British Empire, is this overgrown girl, I guess, in the terms of the rant. This person who is frozen in their trauma of almost being killed, and so spends their entire being just trying to distract from the inevitability of death, the inevitability of the sun setting on the empire. And in addition, like this broader idea of how like modernity and the structure of like believing that, you know, you've put the image, you've put the representation, you've put the laws on the books, therefore things are going to go that way, I think is all tied into this, the more discursive elements of this passage. But the key point, I think, is that like Victoria is credited personally with keeping the lid on a pan-European war up until World War One, by modern.
Oh, that
historians.
I didn't. That makes sense.
Yeah, like it just that she was, because she was related to all of these world leaders.
Yeah.
That she was literally just calling them, you know, not literally, but sending them a letter and saying, "Hey, knock it off." And because she was their grandmother, like just it worked.
Okay, that's important information to know. So from there, we go back to Madame Eskimoff for a very brief moment at the very end of the chapter, where she sort of brings it back down to earth a bit and says, you know, these professors are no laughing matter, and you are well advised, Mr. Basnight, to take the Icosa dyad every bit as seriously as I do. I was among them once, as the fool, or unwise one, as Eliphaz Levi preferred, perhaps most demanding of all the trumps major. Now I have a flock of suburban punters believing, poor souls, that I possess intelligence they will find helpful. Being unwise as ever, I cannot bring myself to disabuse them. There is another historical reference in here because there's not enough of them in the chapter. Eliphaz Levi is a real person. He was a priest that turned into a ceremonial magician and was influential to the development of the Golden Dawn and their rites and their ceremonial magic. He also influenced the Theophosian Society, and he even coined the pentagram being upside down as the sign for the devil, and then being right side up as being the sign for heaven or God. Like that came from him. Yeah, popularization of his beliefs and the way that his writings spread was actually as a result of the weight of the Rider-Waite Tarot. He was responsible during his time in the Golden Dawn for actually translating the texts of Eliphaz Levi. He was the one who discovered his writings and then used them as a basis to launch his own career and to influence all of these different sort of esoteric orders. Most importantly, the Book of Ceremonial Magics was a Eliphaz Levi text that was translated by A.E. Waite. And that book still is used by people who practice Wicca to this day, and all sorts of other kind of esoteric magic systems. So just throwing another one in there right at the kind of 11th hour. And then from there, we just sort of enter the last couple paragraphs of the chapter where Lou asks her that has she somehow switched sides. You know, she's left the order or the Icosa diet and is now stepped over. But of course, it's not exactly that simple. You know, she's speaking in this phrase that like she went from being a member of the Ikosa Dyad to playing a part where she's convinced a bunch of people that what she has to say is important, which indicates that actually it's not, and that she has fooled a whole bunch of people after ceasing to play the fool in her own sort of part of that. And to me, that really speaks to this idea of kind of she has chosen to leave not exactly, but leave the kind of movers and shakers, so to speak, of that Ikosa Dyad to utilizing the knowledge she has from being amongst them to just enlarge her personal importance or finances. And that really, I think, if I'm correct in interpreting that way, gets into a lot of other things that Pynchon has written about, especially it calls to mind in Mason and Dixon, when the literal drawing of the map lines causes people to suddenly think about property and ownership. And that as soon as they kind of have their eyes opened to those possibilities, they turn towards greed, or they turn towards becoming one of the haves instead of the have-nots. Feels like maybe Eskimoff has done the same thing here.
I think that's a pretty decent reading of it. Whatever depths I'm missing, that gets what I can recall from what I was thinking.
Okay.
I do really like the idea that she herself feels trapped in this, which I think is something that it's becoming more of a talking point in, I think, the worst ways possible. But the idea that like nobility is actually a form of punishment,
Mm-hmm.
where she found herself acting the fool in ways that led her to be viewed as a leader, and now she is stuck because she is no more wise.
Yeah.
So it's just it's a fun little bit, because it's something that not very many it's just a nice little bit of humanizing what could otherwise just be framed as a fraudulent character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I guess the question that I have then before we move into most Pynchon Park quotes, all that, is, Luke, has your opinion of this chapter changed at all as a result of this episode?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see why some of it, like a lot of it, was included more now.
Mm-hmm.
I still am kind of frustrated by the way the way Pynchon went about giving us this information.
Yep.
And it does, I mean, like I said, it just kind of feels like he did a bunch of research and then was like, like I have to justify doing this research by sticking it all in the book. I don't know. It does remain to be seen how all this information plays into what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think I appreciate it more just because it's, a lot of what you were talking about was a lot more interesting than some of the stuff, like the way Pynchon phrased it, or the way Pynchon kind of put it in there. Like, I don't know. So I do appreciate it more. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think probably to kind of synthesize what you're, I think Will probably hit the nail on the head when he said that this chapter, or the seeds of it, were probably written a long time ago from a perspective of how it's written versus a lot of the other stuff that we've come in contact with so far. Because, yeah, Cody.
Oh, I was gonna say, just to kind of play around with the idea, like, is there a way that anybody could think of that this information would have been better disseminated, like a longer version of this chapter, having this, I think Kate mentioned earlier, having it spread out more throughout the rest of the book, or is there some other approach that you felt could have been more beneficial to disseminating the information that he kind of really and truly crammed into this what is it, 11 or 12 page chapter?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can't fully answer that question because I haven't read the rest of the book, right? But like, certainly the thought that I have is, yeah, either work some of this stuff in earlier in ways that you can, or maybe the Lou with these guys is a much longer section. I'm sure it is. I'm sure that these characters are a part of the next section of the book that we're reading. But sprinkle these elements in as you tell that story, and as you maybe interact with the professors as they come up more, rather than just put it all here, or at the very least, do what he did with the Baghdad Railway in the chapter, where he does not the full context, but he does include some of why that railway was important anyway. I mean, throwing just a line out about the Berlin conference in particular, where you don't even say what that is or what it represented, that is the kind of thing where that feels kind of crazy to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think the idea that the initial draft of this might have gone back to Gravity's Rainbow writing sessions. I think is, I don't know, the way that I read this chapter, it feels like so much of the information, and it's one of those things where I have slightly more understanding of this historical period than most, it seems. So I don't know if I'm just filling in the blanks, but like it feels like that what this chapter's major flaws are comes down to like a deep understanding of the historical context and an insistence in the way Pynchon always does of writing these things true to the mindset of the time, or if he's using anachronism, using it to productive purpose. It runs into a problem with his kind of okay, sorry. The issue comes about with his method of, I'm going to say encoding. I don't think that's the right way to look at it, but encoding, I guess, messages through like destructive interference of ideas in his books that he utilized to aplomb in his first three. And then as he went on developing as an author, learning more how to situate these things in the context that like a person who isn't trying to read his books from the standpoint of someone trying to like, is this moving the form of the novel forward? So much of what people hate about Vineland is getting rid of that ambiguity, and so much of the difference between this book and Gravity's Rainbow is the ambiguity is sublimated into the actual characters and the plot so much more nicely. However, it still has that feeling of like, well, we're just going to have your characters say crazy shit at each other for hours, and it's going to reasonably demonstrate the mindset of these kinds of people that Pynchon is parodying. And if you do that and you sit and you think and you mull it over, then you start to kind of understand what is not being said. But you have that in combination with all of this like character building and this much more orienting that it, to me at least, feels like he said the same thing like 5 times in this chapter.
Sure, yeah.
Not necessarily. Yeah. Like there are things that tie together in little ways, but it just feels like you said, Kate, that offhand mention of the railroad is much more what he did back in those early years of his writing. And if you're trying to do all of this information, you're trying to present this grand theory of like at least how Britain was viewing itself, that you kind of need to tone back either the information or the humanizing, because it just feels incongruous.
Yeah, the whole thing could have been a lot more concise, definitely, is what I'll say.
Yeah, it is. And I think especially after discussing it with y'all, like I'm seeing more and more of the, for lack of a better term, the flaws in the chapter. And it's a rare misstep where I think I have to wonder if this is a case of authorial, like I guess overindulgence in his own knowledge and just kind of assuming that the reader would know this information. Which is, I mean, if this is like Will said, if this was something that was written around the time of Gravity's Rainbow, I think that's a safer assumption to make, just because the kind of people who would be reading this book are the kind of people who are going to spend a lot of time at a library anyway. and would just have that level of knowledge. Maybe not to the extent that he does, but you know what I mean? Like they're more willing to go sit down and just read books about, what started World War I and all these little nuanced parts of history. Whereas a reader in 2006, 2007, and 2025 isn't necessarily going to have that same capacity for just offhand knowledge of world history.
Mhm.
And that's not necessarily a fault of the reader, nor do I think it's necessarily a fault of Pynchon. I just think it's a weird sort of thing of maybe an editor should have stepped in and been like, hey, this needs some more work. Like this needs to either be fleshed out or pulled back, or we need to throw another chapter in, or we need to find some way to get this information across, but in a more even and digestible manner.
Mhm.
But maybe part of that was just because we're already, this is already a almost 1,100 page book. We're pushing the literal boundaries of the format at the time. So I don't know. It's interesting. It is, as we've said, it's a good chapter. There's a lot of information. I just, I think it was more of this felt like a throw everything in the kitchen sink and just see what happens kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, are there any funny parts that we missed?
I was said with such a low. No, I don't think so. I think as far as I have marked, I think we covered all of the stuff that I thought was pretty funny.
I'll keep it short. Just there's a ton of little stuff in the long diatribes that is just like indicative of the characters misunderstanding exactly what they're talking about, and it's just very funny. Like there aren't any particular things that I can really point to. It's more like that earlier discussion from the Grand Cohen about like overlapping timelines. It's just like, okay, you're not actually saying anything of substance here. It's just funny.
Yeah, that there is a lot of that for sure.
I do find the first two paragraphs, first two sentences of the chapter to be at least somewhat comedic. Calling America oppressively wholesome is, I mean, it is kind of funny how some people seem to view like there's a side of America that is kind of oppressively wholesome, then there's a side that's also kind of impressively debaucherous. And that's kind of always been true about America, maybe. I don't really. I haven't spent enough time in Europe to really figure out how different America is from Europe in terms of wholesomeness. But and also just the back to the delights of evil. Is just it's not hilarious, but it's pretty funny for somebody to say that, and I assume mean being in England and perhaps having more freedom to be weird or to be out out of step with everyone else. Yeah, I also think that the whole obsession with the Tetractus. I talked about this in the group chat a few weeks ago, our personal group chat. But I do think the group's obsession with it. We already went over the historical context of the Tetractus and how there is more to it than first meets the eye. But I do think it is meant to be perhaps at least somewhat a joke that they're so obsessed with it, considering when you look at it on a page, it's just it's just a pyramid made of numbers. If that makes sense. I don't know if I'm communicating that correctly. It does strike me as perhaps meant to be somewhat comedic that they're so obsessed with something so simple, whereas these other occult societies are a lot more they're a lot more wide ranging in their obsession, and perhaps what they're obsessed with would more easily be something that people in the modern day at least would be obsessed with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. The thing that really delights me about that is the fact that it's been decimalized. it like that is, I think, to me at least, and I think from this, like, just trying to imagine being someone who's like writing this full chapter of like weird punning on occultist ideas, to just have this like indication of infinity be limited to 10 numbers by convenience.
Mm-hmm.
That strikes me as a very Pynchon joke, especially given his discussion of numeralization throughout his
Yeah, I agree. What about quotes? Who's got a quote to share? Mine's short. I can 223. Just a brief description of what life with TWIT is like for Lou, where it says, there were mysteries enough. Windowless carriages were arriving at Chunkston Crescent in the middle of the night amid scientifically muffled hoofbeats. Impressively sealed documents were shuffled aside whenever Lou approached the Grand Cohen's desk. Less than professionally clandestine attempts were made to have a look in his own field books. Was it by way of a friendly word of caution? Or did somebody want him to be suspicious? Maybe even trying to provoke him into doing himself some damage. It's nothing too like amazing, right? Especially in the broad scheme of the stuff that the chapter is doing. But I really like when Pynchon just dedicates a paragraph to just sort of setting a scene, and that was one that for me worked really well, just to kind of depict this slightly offbeat secret society that Lou has come in contact with, and I just really enjoyed the visual of it.
That is a good one. Mine is actually the last, well, not last, but on the last page, 232, where Lou is talking to. Hold on. Sorry, I'm trying to juggle a book and a mic in my hand at the same time. It's not working well. Lou and Madame Eskimoff. She smiled, it seemed to him, a little condescendingly. Sides? Well, no, not exactly. It had become an impediment to my calling, so I resigned and joined the TWIT instead, not without later occasion for regret. Hard enough being a woman, you see, but Pythagorean into the bargain. Well, it seemed that each British mystical order claiming the Pythagorean descent had its own ideas about those taboos and bits of free advice known as akumasata, what can't read right now. And Madame Eskimoff's favorite happened to be number 24, listed by Iamblichus. Never look into a mirror when there's a lamp next to you, meaning one must rearrange one's entire day, making sure one is finished dressing well before nightfall, not to mention hair and maquillage, all of which is sure to look different under gas or electric light anyway. Just nice way to end the chapter. I think we kind of covered that already at the end of our discussion about it, but there was I think most of the other things I had selected as quotes were the insane walls of text, where I'm like, I don't really want to dive too far into that, but I think it's a great way to end this chapter, yeah, in spite of all its flaws. And yeah, I don't have anything else on that.
So my quote is from 223. Kate actually read out the beginning of it. I'm going to read it out again. Suppose there were no such thing after all as original sin. Suppose the serpent in the Garden of Eden was never symbolic, but a real being in a real history of intrusion from somewhere else, say from behind the sky. Say we were perfect. We were law-abiding and clean. Then one day they arrived. And this is how you explain villains and bad men among an otherwise moral population. Not that Lou was looking for an argument. He was genuinely puzzled. You will see it in practice. I just wouldn't want it to be too rude a surprise. The initial paragraph is just really interesting to think about. Generally, it does astound me that so many religious people view the Garden of Eden as literally true. That whole story, I'm constantly like it constantly, or at least it used to. Whenever I went to church and ran in Christian circles and was much more immersed in that subsection of humanity. But I mean, it's it's just really, like saved from behind the sky. Like it does seem to be kind of implying that the devil or the biblical Satan is like, a interdimensional being or something. I don't know. I could go on for a long time about that initial paragraph. And it is just really fun to think about, and it's kind of amazing that it's just kind of thrown in there. And it's you could write a whole paper about that paragraph. You could write a whole book basically about that whole paragraph, I would say.
That's true.
I mean, it's really interesting to think about, in my opinion. So
I suppose I'll be the lame one and I'll read out a long section.
What a rebel.
I know. I'm so brave. On page 227, Madame Natalia Eskimoff's rooms ran to Mamluk lamps and draped fabrics and Indian prints, smoke rising from elaborate brass incense burners, furniture of carved figwood, and odd corners that seemed designed to warn off all but the most unfrivolous of seekers. And Lou was enchanted right away, for the lady herself was just a peach. Eyes huge and expressive as those you'd expect to see more in magazine illustrations than out in the troublesome world. Volumes of silver-streaked tresses that invited some reckless hand to unpin it all just to see how far down her form it would reach. Tonight she wore a black taffeta turnout that looked simple but not severe and probably had set her back a bundle, as well as amber beads and a lalique brooch. Other nights, depending on how swanky the function and fashionable the gown, there might also be observed tattooed in exquisite symmetry below Madame Eskimoff's bared nape, the Kabbalist tree of life, with the names of the Sephiroth spelled out in Hebrew, which had brought her more than enough of that uniquely snot-nosed British anti-Semitism. Eskimoff. I say, what sort of name is that? Though in fact she'd grown up in the Eastern Church and, to the disappointment of racial watchdogs throughout the island, what in fact she turned out to be confoundingly was a classical English rose. And that one, mostly picked it because I think it does it does a better job of like capturing in words the like aesthetic ideals of that like post Gilded Age, pre Jazz Age, like pinup culture. Better than I think I've seen many other authors write, without going like full lascivious with it. It's just a really good kind of like word painting of a new age aunt if she were around today.
Yeah, agreed. Well, that brings us to most pinch on part of the chapter. You can narrow it down to one part.
I'm gonna say what part of this chapter is not pinch on?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've gone over it too much for me to be able to pick just one. So I'm gonna do the cop out. I'm just gonna say the whole thing.
Yeah, that's
this chapter's existence as a piece of writing.
It's. I think, like I said earlier, it's a showcase of what he's very good at, but not in the best way. So it's a good representation of how a great author can still have flaws.
yeah, for me, it is the information dumps, I would say, the amount of research that probably went into them. Doing that kind of stuff is not, I mean, like Neal Stephenson comes to mind as somebody else who does a lot of research and then does information dumps. But, some of my favorite parts of Gravity's Rainbow are the information dumps about like their raros and their history and stuff. He does it really well sometimes, and I feel like he's done it well in earlier and later parts of this book as well. It's just these weren't my favorite information dumps of his. This is a very Pinchonian thing to do. Yeah,
it's just kind of the thing with info dumps. Is like it's a really hit or miss thing to do because when it works, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. There's almost no in between at all. Like I agree with you totally about Gravity's Rainbow, and like to point to Stephenson, like Cryptonomicon is great, and there's some really really cool info dumps in that book, but there are some parts where it just drags. So yeah, it's a real hard thing to do very well, and for this to be the kind of rare misstep is totally forgivable.
I guess I'll have to say I'm thinking I'm just gonna have to pick the kind of the joke where Yashmin is complaining about how English speakers don't take their own words seriously. And it's followed up with Lou making what is very clearly, a joke, basically saying, like, you are a canny person. You are saying these brave things, and whether or not Lou knows it, us the readers are sitting here thinking, yeah, it's hilarious to joke that it would be that she shouldn't be able to vote, and then to have that followed up with the counterpoint of the Cohen going through his long description of this counterfactual theory. There's one other joke in here, and that's why I'm frustrated. There's one other joke that is someone saying something that they don't take very seriously, and that in fact the whole point of them saying it is that it's ironic. Where that one, where Lou saying, "Cohen man, that's horrible." The Grand Cohen shrugged. "Only a bit of fun. You Yanks are so serious." I don't know. There's a pacing to those jokes that I think a lot of effort for really no payoff.
And Norm MacDonald joke.
Well, yeah, I can't find the damn middle joke.
Well, we have received some correspondence. Who wants to read the email that we got from Reese?
I'll take it.
I can. Yeah.
I think Luke should do the Apple podcast.
All right. Yeah, that's fine.
We got an email from Reese, and just very short and to the point, says, all I want to say is give me the 6-hour episode. That's all. I greatly appreciate your content. We didn't hit 6 hours like we thought we were going to, but I think we got close. I don't know.
If you put this episode and last week's together, it's definitely 6 hours.
So thank you, Reese. I appreciate the fact that you love our long-winded discourse.
Yeah, thank you, Reese. I think we all continue to be blown away by the audience retention we have through the length of some of the episodes that we release.
Yeah.
Well, we got an Apple Podcast review for Luke.
Not for the show, for Luke.
So the Apple Podcast review is from Daniel MH the second, I think, 112. Anyway, I like Luke. That's it. I like him. Thank you, Daniel. I'm 99% sure that Daniel is the friend from college that has come up on this podcast a few times. I don't necessarily want to be more specific than that in terms of when I've mentioned him, because our biggest fans will probably be able to figure out which episode I'm thinking of. Anyways, thank you, Daniel, for the review. We all appreciate it.
Do we all? I feel left out.
I appreciate it, at least.
I appreciate it. It's not a false.
I like Luke too. So
we all like Luke. Will, do you want to take this one from Blue Sky?
Sure. So this one's from Beast World on Blue Sky. Chapter 18 was a great episode, and I hope Luke enjoyed the gig. It hadn't occurred to me that the monkey governor was a nod to Randall Flagg. I totally see it now. Looking forward to chapter 19. And I guess what your comment has led me to is to turn to Luke and say, well, did you enjoy the gig?
I did, actually. It was really fun. They played with an orchestral accompaniment, which made it that much more special. I went with a friend that hadn't really listened to them before, and the friend seemed to really enjoy them, and that was also fun to see him be just as into the concert as I was, despite him not being nearly as big of a fan. I highly recommend going to see King Gizzard when and if you can. Prices for the concerts have gone up, admittedly. That being said, they're probably not the best concerts I've ever been to, but they're probably top 5, top 10, most certainly. And I would say they're probably. I think it's safe to say they're probably top 3, top 5 live acts touring right now. At least if you're into like jam bands or bands that jam out a little bit more. I'm not sure I'd call them a jam band, but they do jam a lot. Yeah, it was really fun, and it was nice to be in Colorado because it wasn't nearly as hot as it is in Texas. So,
But yeah, there's your answer to your unposed question. But yeah, thanks for writing in, and I too was shocked by Cody's connection drawing there with the Randall flag reference.
All right, lastly, we have a YouTube comment from TDF101. It says, reading this book now, Bleeding Edge, was searching for a spoiler-free reviews online, surprised at how little there is on this novel. I don't see it as light. I just think that P is having fun after more extreme works he wrote before. We're talking about this novel and Inherent Vice. I would also think he's making fun, in this case, the whole time/period era he set the story in. World is too complicated to understand. Even if conspiracies are there, they are out of control, and we've lost the plot. I agree. I don't think it's pinch on light either. I think that pretty much when any of us use that phrase on this show, we're almost using it derisively, pointed towards the people who say that word in actual seriousness. I don't think there's a single one of his books that is light compared to the rest of sort of literature. Just by virtue of reading him, you're sort of signing yourself up to something pretty heavy. But it's an excellent book, and I agree. There's not many resources out on it. That was why we wanted to really make sure that we did a great episode or a great season with that book. And I think it's amongst our best as far as coverage goes. So
yeah.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. For next episode, we're going to be covering chapter 20. Pynchon's sort of unceasing in his door-stopping chapters, so we're going to split up the next two just like we have these two. That is going to comprise pages 233 to 242. If you're someone who has a different pagination, then we're going to be ending on the quote, "It might have been the residual effects of cyclamite abuse, but Lou swore he could hear an invisible room full of laughter," and some applause as well. Thank you, as always, for listening to the show. Especially thank you to anyone who made it through all 4 hours of this episode, that I'm sure it'll end up being by the time it's all edited and ready to go. If you like what we're doing, if you think our show is worth $1, then we would love to have that dollar. We are available for donations on Ko-Fi. We don't ask for any specific amount, just whatever it is that you feel like donating. That money will be used to pay for hosting, for equipment costs, and anything else to make the podcast better. As I say pretty much every time we release one of these episodes, it has already really impacted our ability to recover from either, in some cases, theft, in some cases, equipment failure, or just to pay our hosting fees so that you guys are able to access all of the episodes that we've recorded instead of just a selection of them. So thank you so much for everyone who has donated. And thank you for everyone who will donate. If you also want to get in touch with us and end up getting your correspondence on the air, just like our listeners that you just heard from did, you can reach out to us on a number of different avenues. The most direct route to us is our email, which is mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are also available on Blue Sky, on bluesky.app/profile/mappingthezone.bsky.social. We are also present on Twitter, primarily for show updates. We don't post too much on there anymore, but you can still get in touch with us through direct messages. And we are there on Twitter at PinchonPod. You can also find us on Instagram at instagram.com/mappingthezonepodcast. And until next time, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
see ya.
Bye.
So, I finally did it. Finally watched Eraserhead.
You've never seen it before?
I've never seen any of David Lynch's movies unless you count What Did Jack Do?
Okay. Wow, that's a really weird one to have only seen that one of his filmography. Interesting. What did you think? What did you think of Eraserhead?
It was a really it was one of those viewing experiences where you go through like every possible configuration of opinions throughout it, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, and by the end, I was just like, okay. Not only do I don't, not to imply I do understand, but I do get what Lynch was pointing at with the whole "this is my most spiritual movie" thing.
Mhm.
And also, I do get like why a movie like that would launch a career like Lynch's, because it does make like the movie makes sense in all of the ways that everybody loves Lynch for making sense, and it makes no
Yeah.
sense in all the ways people love Lynch for not making sense. So
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I get it.
I think it's interesting that it's arguably maybe aside from I guess if you set aside the Straight Story, it's maybe Blue Velvet too. It's one of his few films that is actually very linear in its narrative, but it's still the surrealism of it and the just general uncomfortability of it. I think makes people forget how linear it is, and they tend to kind of put it in with the things like Mulholland Drive or Inland Empire or Lost Highway, where it's like this fractured narrative. But it's I'm with you too. Understanding that it is his most spiritual film. He mentioned at some point that the whole thing came to him when he opened up the Bible to a random page and read a particular line, and that was kind of the genesis of the whole story. I've always been kind of curious to figure out like what that line might be, but at the same time, I don't want to ruin the sort of magic of it, so I just kind of stay away from it.
Yeah, I don't know. I spent my whole life mad at the representative or representational nature of most movies. So like, I knew that was Lynch's whole thing, was getting away from that trend, and I knew
Yeah.
that he was good at it. Otherwise, no one would give a shit about any of his movies.
Yeah.
But it was nice to see the proof.
I mean, and that's just really the tip of the iceberg too. Like Eraserhead's
I'm
a
sure.
fantastic film. Don't get me wrong. It's not. It's a good. I think it's a good maybe one of the better gateways into his work, especially the more abstract elements of his work. But it's. I wouldn't say it would be like my overall like this is Lynch's most Lynch kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it felt like a student film.
Yeah. Oh
And,
yeah. Oh yeah.
Like,
And one that
not in a
was
bad
filmed
way.
over like 12 years or something like that.
Yeah.
That detail about Jack Nance opening the door
and
and closing the door like 8 months later or whatever is one of the parts
It's
of that movie's
wild.
history.
So yeah, I'd been putting off watching more of his movies, but now I have like an actual emotional intention to do so, which means I'll put it off even more, I'm sure.
Well, keep us posted as you watch more. I'm curious to get your thoughts on them.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where he goes. Also, just really funny. I've never seen anyone talk about this. What's the Coen Brothers movie? The one about the screenwriter.
Barton Fink?
Thank you. I can't believe no one ever talks about the way that Barton Fink was obviously influenced.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, tremendously. Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem is I never can talk about that movie because I don't know anyone else who's ever watched it. Everyone I know who is a Coen Brothers fan has seen all of the like Coen Brothers staples. They've not watched things like Blood Simple or The Man Who Wasn't There or Barton Fink, which I think is maybe one of their better films altogether, and one of maybe John Goodman's best performances of all time. It's a criminally underrated film.
Definitely.
It's either that performance or John Goodman's random performance in True Stories, I would say, would be my top 2 Goodman performances.